All right. So we're going to get going here. My name is Christopher Taylor with Sovereign Harmony. So I appreciate you being here if you are on live. And if you're seeing this on YouTube, feel welcome to watch it in pieces or, put it in double speed because there is a lot of information. So we're not going to skimp on the information in this presentation here. The Saturn Neptune conjunction in Aries, 0 degrees Aries at that. To me, this is the most significant transit that we have in this decade for sure, and even for the next couple of decades. And the reason is every time Saturn and Neptune conjunct each other, it really is the start of a new societal evolution cycle in essence. And what we're doing here is something very different than previous transitions. So what I'll do here is go over some previous transitions, passing the baton essentially from one Saturn Neptune cycle to another. And our most recent cycle has been a lot about narrative, a lot about top down government, corporate kind of control in controlling narratives, et cetera, et cetera. What we're heading into is more of an era of discernment. Okay, and that has a lot to do with my phrase here, my brand, Sovereign Harmony. This is the idea of being totally self-contained, like the saying says. We're not a drop in the ocean; we're the entire ocean contained within one drop. Okay, and that's really the philosophy that I kind of work with when I use astrology, etc. Okay, and this is a free webinar, so if you're on the webinar, totally free, no obligation or anything. If you do feel like you learned something here, like you got some really valuable information, something you'd want to share with other people, I do have my Venmo and my PayPal here, so that is something that you can do if you want. If you wanted to donate something, but do it because you really feel like you got something out of this. Not out of any obligation for sure, because I enjoy doing this as it is. So it doesn't really matter to me either way. So why don't we dive on in then? So Saturn conjunct Neptune. When is it the 1 degree orb, not necessarily the exact conjunction, will initiate this summer. Okay, so from about June 9th to August 23rd, that's pretty much the entire summer. They will be within 1 degree of each other. They will not form an exact conjunction. The only time they will form an exact conjunction will be next February, the 20th. Okay, and that will be in the 1 degree orb for basically most of February into March. But February 20th will be that exact conjunction. That's when we're really resetting things essentially, and that is at 0 degrees Aries. Very powerful point. Beginning of the zodiac. It's like a clean slate in a lot of ways. Okay, and because it's in Aries, a lot of the energy here really comes down to us as individuals as far as where it goes from here. And we'll see that the previous two Saturn-Neptune conjunctions and the cycles that came with them had a lot to do with outside forces having control. Okay, and so that's a big reason why this is a difference. Just to give you a brief overview, I'm going to go a little deeper into these. Going back two cycles from the current one that we'll start here, that one was a conjunction in Libra. Okay, Libra, sign of relations, sign of balance, etc. That conjunction happened in 1952, and then the next conjunction was in 1989. So 1989 was the conclusion of this cycle and the initiation of the next cycle. Just like we're still in this Capricorn cycle here that will conclude here in the next several months into early 2026. But this period here had a lot to do with global relations. Okay, this was the Cold War, plain and simple. Biggest theme there, and it was the idea of picking a side. Right, you're either with the capitalists, you're with the communists. That was it. There really was no nuance in that sense. Okay, and that really kind of formed essentially like the essence of political parties and whatnot. Is that idea of those sides and that dichotomy. Okay, when that ended, and we'll see, there was a pretty significant event that really clearly showed that this cycle was over. That happened in 1989 that we'll talk about. And then that started, the next conjunction was in Capricorn, 1989. And again, that'll end here. We're ending it here essentially over the next 10 months or so. This being April of 2025. So by the time we get to February 2025, that is when this will be over and the new one will be done. We'll be done with. This conjunction in Capricorn has a whole lot to do with what I call global corporatocracy. It's just kind of like a blend of corporate and government interests, and very top down. It's Capricorn energy, very top down. Okay. And in my opinion, and you can disagree, but in my opinion, this was the end of the sides for all intents and purposes, where those sides really did exist, and it kind of infiltrated the political parties in most countries, including the US. In my opinion, once that Cold War was over, there was no more sides anymore. It was really just top versus down. Okay. And so, like, for example, like in the US, in my opinion, every president that we had, which George Bush Sr. was inaugurated in 89, it was him, then 8 years of Clinton, 8 years of George Jr., and then 8 years of Obama. Okay. And there was supposed to be, if the globalists had their way, it would have been 8 years of Hillary that would have brought us to this point today, pretty much. Right up until just a few months ago with the January 2025 election, because she probably would have had 8 years. It didn't work out for them. There was a block in that trajectory for the global corporatocracy, and we're going to talk about that too. Okay. But the idea being is that there's sort of a merger. There was the globalist right and the globalist left, but there really wasn't an actual left and right starting around this point. We've been made to believe there is, and we're going to get into things that developed in terms of the media, et cetera, media manipulation that really, in fact, drove that sense of separation deeper, even though on the top, it didn't really exist. They were all kind of globalists on the same side, unless you were an anti-globalist that disrupted that, which again, we'll talk about. Then that brings us to this Aries 0 degrees point conjunction that we are having now, okay? And that's, again, officially starts February 2026, but again, that 1 degree orb will be in effect summer of 2025. So we are warming up for this. So we're in the phase of completion for this round and in the warm up for the initiation of this round. And this is going to last till June of 2061. The next conjunction will be Saturn-Neptune will be in Gemini. Okay, we're not going to talk about that. It's a little too far off. We're going to focus on these two, especially this one, because we're in this one and it's ending. Okay, and then some implications of this one, because we really don't know what is going to happen with Saturn, Neptune, and Aries. It's really like, your guess is as good as mine in a lot of ways, because it is Aries. It's the 0 degree point. It's coming from us. It's the self. So it really depends on what we decide, what we choose, where our consciousness is over this period. And if we're going to get away from that separation that was created from that top-down influence and, come together and rise as individuals with nuance of opinion and sovereign discernment, right? Where we're not manipulated by media entities anymore. I mean, one of the things we'll talk about here when we get into it is, the fall of mainstream media and kind of the rise of independent media. And that's really, that really represents itself in this energy here, okay? So we're going to see more of that. We're kind of seeing the beginnings of that now, but we're going to see more of that. And so in general, Saturn, Neptune, the cycle itself really has to do with structuring the narrative, like what is our essential societal belief of what is true and what is not true, and also societal evolution, because we have Saturn, a planet associated with society, and then we have an evolutionary planet in Neptune. Okay, so just a little background on me. So this is going to be relevant just because, especially when we talk about the Saturn, Neptune, and Capricorn cycle that we're ending now, and how it plays together with my background in education. So I got my bachelor's degree in meteorology, Plymouth State, New Hampshire. I've always been kind of like a weather geek and whatnot. I decided that the actual profession didn't really appeal to me, even though I still, love weather history. Climate science was a big thing for me back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I got a master's in atmospheric science. I even taught global climate at UC Davis to undergrads, which I really enjoyed. And, and I've watched the kind of the evolution of the narrative of climate change over these last 20 to 25 years. And and you're going to see how that really coincides with the globalist interest in this Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn. Okay, and we'll see how that really fits in. I got another master's degree in environmental science and management. I figured I was going to go in that direction. That's what the world was going. And I even did a thesis on greenhouse gases, actually in both cases, both masters. And in both cases, I realized some things, that are counter to the narratives that we hear today. But anyway, I don't do anything with this on a professional level right now. But it is nice to have in the background because it's going to help me understand some things on a larger scale. This will be me on an astrological level. So if you're into astrology, like you probably are, if you're watching this video, there's my birth details. Born in Massachusetts, but I was born actually during a lunar eclipse in Virgo. You can see the Pisces sun about 4 minutes before sunset and about 10 minutes before that eclipsed moon rose in the east, if you were in central Massachusetts from that perspective. And, Pisces, Virgo rising, if you're familiar with Kenny Loggins, he had a song, Even Though We Ain't Got Money. And in the beginning of the third verse, it actually starts with, Pisces Virgo rising is a very good sign, strong and kind, and a little boy is mine. Anyway, so Kenny Loggins wrote a song about me, whether he knows about it or not. But that's kind of like a prime theme in my chart. So balancing the details with the bigger picture, essentially, and that theme accentuates itself with this Mars-Saturn opposition that also goes across from Pisces Virgo. So strong Pisces Virgo axis, and I just have this yod that includes my ruling planet, Mercury. Okay, so there's the eclipse there. There's the ruling planet, Mercury. And so in Aries, I tend to be pretty blunt, to the point. I don't beat around the bush, and I call it like I see it. That's also forming a sextile to Venus. That's part of that yod. Venus in Aquarius, squaring Uranus. And with Uranus in aspect to my sun, moon, and ascendant, yeah, I'm into some weird stuff, like astrology, for example. That's why I'm doing this, but that's kind of underneath, the dark side of the chart, the underside. And so I come across as pretty conventional looking. My ruling planet is in Aries, so I'm conventional masculine looking kind of person, but I'm into that weird stuff down here. I'm the kind of person that can really bridge that gap between weird stuff like astrology and everyday life. And that's kind of what I try to focus like this presentation on. And the way I interpret astrology is very down to earth, very to the point, and not getting too technical with techniques and being too out there for the average person to be able to digest. So even if you're not into astrology, I tend to be someone that attracts people to their very first astrology reading ever, because I seem so normal, etc. So that Uranus speaks differently to that. I am a little bit weird, a little different, a little eccentric. That Jupiter up there does a similar thing with my sun, moon, and ascendant, and that's in the 11th house. And you're kind of getting a taste of that here in this presentation, where Jupiter in 11th house, the 11th house is a place where I tend to expand. So if we're talking to groups and whatnot, I did this talk at the San Diego Astrological Society a couple weeks ago, went off really well, and I wanted to make sure that more people could get this information than just people that attended that, because if you weren't geographically near there, it would be possible to do. But anyway, so that's a glimpse at me, and my style is going to be very much looking at the big picture and then diving into the details, and giving exact examples. That Mercury to the moon, it's a quinticelli, 165 degrees. So the combination of that Mercury and Aries, moon and Virgo, there's a lot of exactness, preciseness. I like solid information that can be shown and proven, etc. And this is where that Saturn-Neptune is going to land in my chart, 7th house. We'll see how that plays out. Not sure exactly, but the next 10 months will probably give me a pretty good clue. Anyway, so what structured narratives or in societal evolution were associated with the previous Saturn-Neptune cycles? Like I said, I'll go over some previous cycles. So we're going to go back to that one that started in 1952. That was a conjunction in Libra. Okay, we'll talk about, we're going to just briefly move through this cycle because I just want to show, establish how this works. So there's the initial conjunction. There is the waxing square in the early 60s, the opposition, this is a culmination phase in the early 70s, and then the waning square around the time I was born. I was born in 79, right there. And then obviously the end of that cycle was again in 1989. Okay. And so what happened in the conjunction phase, that it was in 1 degree orb from 1952 to August of 1953. So for almost a year there. And I think the main thing that really happened there was in March of 1953, so right in the middle of this, Stalin died. Okay. And if you remember from history, Stalin and the Soviet Union were allies to the US and Great Britain in World War II. And it was upon his death, essentially, that really kind of, when this new leader came in, when Khrushchev came in, he became the first secretary of the Communist Party. This really established that sense of the Cold War. Again, a sense of those sides. Whereas Stalin was a kind of when someone's your ally, sometimes it's harder to form an enemyship essentially. But Khrushchev had no such loyalties, right? And so this is really, in essence, when the Cold War started. And so the idea was that we were going to peacefully coexist between the East and West. May the best, form of governance win. The whole space race and everything like that was established right here. So it's like, okay, you do your thing, we do our thing, and then we move on. So then we go to the waxing square. This is a very simple. You can see in that time frame, May of 62 to February 63. Well, what happened like smack in the middle of that was in October of 62. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, pretty big deal. And what it was that when the conjunction established the relationship, you have two global superpowers with nuclear weapons, and of course they're going to want to play with their toys, and of course they're going to, even if they said they're going to be peaceful, they're going to test each other. And what ended up happening is by September of 62, the Defense Intelligence Agency in the U.S. noticed there was Cuban surface-to-air missiles in an alarming pattern, whatever that means. And then in October, the CIA took photos and said, yeah, those are medium-range ballistic missiles. And then by October 27th, Kennedy secretly agreed to remove our bombs from Italy and Turkey, which they probably shouldn't have been there anyway in the first place. But, again, when you have toys, you play with your toys. So we set up bombs in Italy and Turkey, and then Khrushchev said, fine, we will remove all the missiles in Cuba. But that could have been a whole lot worse. That was a pretty big deal. Not a small situation whatsoever, but that speaks to that tension, that building tension from setting up that relationship, setting up that sense of two very distinct sides. Energetically, that's hard to not build tension when you create such a definitive sense of sides. Anyway, so then we get to the opposition, which is the culmination phase. Okay, in this sense, from June 1971 to April 1972, and what happened pretty much at the very end of this, late March into early to mid-April, right around Easter. That's why it's called the Easter Offensive in Vietnam. And so now think of Vietnam, it's basically a proxy war for the two nuclear powers, right? It's the Soviet Union against the US. And they're both defending a side of Vietnam for whatever reason. It's just a proxy war. It's like, again, you have to have some way to show those aggressions, those hidden aggressions that are happening there. And so this is just that culmination of everything that was building up. Okay, in the Easter Offensive, pretty simply, it was basically three advances by North Vietnam into South Vietnam. Obviously, the U.S. retaliated, but it was pretty much getting pretty well known and understood that we were getting nowhere in the Vietnam War, and that it was just a waste of human life, ammunition, money, everything. We weren't getting anywhere. We weren't going to make any progress, and so it was a culmination of this idea of having to accept that we can respect each other's differences, but maybe we shouldn't be fighting a proxy war over it. And then finally we get to the waning square, from September of 79 to July of 1980, and right in the middle of that we had this anti-American demonstration that was outside the embassy at Tehran, Iran, and there was hostages and everything. In April 1980, the rescue forces attempted to make a rescue, but they had to turn back. It was called off. But then eventually, once Reagan got in 81, they immediately released the hostages. And but the idea is this is also having a lot to do with the Cold War. Iran, again, another proxy place where both the Soviet Union and the U.S. had interests. And so, this is pretty obviously something that was probably stirred up by the Soviet Union against the anti-American demonstration, essentially, and so that led to the hostages, etc. Then this all came to a close in 1989. Right, there's the people on the Berlin Wall in Germany. There's Margaret Thatcher. Again, just to remind us of the history of this, in September of '89, Margaret Thatcher was basically pleading with Gorbachev, the president of the Soviet Union, not to let the Berlin Wall fall. But November 8th, I should say November 9th, sorry, the Berlin Wall did fall. That's when it began falling. And notice what happens, because this is going to really help us understand the transition between the, this cycle and the cycle that we are on now, that's ending now, the one that started in 89. Because the day before the Berlin Wall started falling, it's like she was about to pass the baton of the Cold War, which is going to be no longer this thing, this like way of keeping people under control, and this global threat, essentially, right? The global threat of nuclear annihilation. If that goes away, well, how are we going to keep people under control? And so almost immediately, from a globalist perspective, again, because that's exactly what the theme is of this conjunction in Capricorn that happened right around here, is the idea that we need another danger, another danger. And so what she said was, while the conventional political dangers, the threat of global annihilation, the fact of regional war appear to be receding, again, what do we do with our war going away? We have all recently become aware of another insidious danger. It is the prospect of irretrievable damage to the atmosphere, to the oceans, to the earth itself. And like you saw with my background, I mean, as a meteorology major, I worked in climate science and I did environmental science and management. So I do have an understanding of how those things work from the bottom up, but also how the top down can utilize that to their advantage, et cetera. Okay. And we're going to see how that plays out. Okay. So my question, kind of the theme of the major theme of this, before we start talking about, what the prospects are for Saturn-Neptune in Aries and what that's going to mean from here in the coming decades, is the climate change narrative the Berlin Wall, essentially, of the current Saturn-Neptune cycle. Okay, so the Berlin Wall was really the symbol of the Cold War, and that was the whole theme of that previous cycle. And in a lot of ways, the narrative of climate change, which is basically the idea that we are annihilating ourselves, right? Just like the nuclear war could have annihilated us, right? And blaming it on specifically carbon dioxide emissions, and the idea that if we can control that, well, then we can protect the climate, right? And what this does is it kind of conflates together the idea of climate and environmentalism. Environmentalism, which includes things like pollution and habitats and things, very real, usually attacked from the bottom up, grassroots, and it makes its way up to congressional levels and things like that, and to holding corporations accountable and whatnot. Whereas this climate change and the idea of carbon dioxide emissions specifically really is a top-down control, and we're gonna see how that works as we move through this. And it's really not an environmental issue so much as it is more of a concept that we're supposed to not distinguish from environmentalism, when in reality we can't control the climate so much. I mean, in that sense, we're going to see here. So before we get into that, because what I'm going to do is try to show high value information for the most part. Okay. I mean, if it's my opinion, I'll say it's my opinion, but I'm going to show high value information that just kind of tells us what is. And to distinguish that from low value information. Okay. Low value information is essentially what you see when you see headlines, right? Nothing to back it up. We don't know what it's designed to control your emotions and your thoughts about things. It's really not designed to inform. And so, like, for example, this just happened earlier this month when the tariffs went into play, and nobody knows what the stock market is going to do, right? But CNN seemed to be pretty clear on what it was going to do. And if you turn on any of the, national news networks, it was basically, this is the end of the world. Stock market's completely crashed. No one's going to have retirement money. It's all over. Here, I mean, this headline isn't really that crazy, but it's just getting to the idea of what was going on that week, following the tariffs and whatnot, was, a lot of fear mongering that the stock market is going to totally crash. Okay. But then we look at the high value information, which is, looking at the stock market, between 2022 to 2023, there was a pretty extended long period of drop off, but then a nice little rise for a while, right? And there it is right there. And what happened in early April after those tariffs? Yeah, pretty big dip. That is a significant dip for sure. But in context, it's still, it went back up pretty significantly after that as well. But even that minimum point, still much higher than anything in 2022 or 2023, or even 2021, right? So in context, was it how bad was it really? And can you really predict that it was going to go in that direction? Like, all the pundits were pretty much convinced that yes, this is the end of the world, end of the stock market. You're all screwed if you have money in a stock market kind of thing. But the context of the high value information kind of puts that low value information to sleep a little bit. Okay. And the problem is we're pretty much trained to accept low value information if it comes from accepted sources, like the news, right? I mean, we're trained from day one. You know, what your parents say is what goes. What teachers say is what goes. What your boss says is what goes. And what the media says is what's true, right? Even though they very seldom use high value information to back up certain claims. And we're also, you know, kind of really trained to ridicule high value information if it's not from accepted sources. So, you know, if someone is not deemed an accepted source, then no matter what the stats say, you know, what the high value information says, which you don't need a source for, you just need your own discernment, right? Because this is where we're headed, right? To this age of discernment. And if with your own discernment, you can see that yes, this is a drop off, but in context, it's still a lot higher than what we experienced for a good number of years, right? So this is what I introduced that idea, because we're going to go over some stuff as we set the backdrop for this cycle of Saturn-Neptune. So this Saturn-Neptune cycle started in 1989 in Capricorn, like we said. That was with the fall of the Berlin Wall. That signified the end of the previous Saturn-Neptune cycle, having to do with the Cold War, and the beginning of this global corporatocracy cycle, this top-down control where government and corporations are working together, where there's really no left or right at the top anyway. You know, they try to create it amongst the masses to divide us, but at the top there really is none. There's just the globalist right, globalist left. When a globalist right person was in office, in office, their administration's job was to weaken other countries to get them in line with the globalist plans, in overturning the governments and whatnot. And then when a leftist globalist is in power, they're weakening America's trade. They're doing things to make it to the point where America has a better choice of joining a global order than staying sovereign, etc. Okay, that's just the general way to look at that. Then the waxing square is in the late 90s. The opposition, the culmination, 2006, 2007-ish, and then the waning square, 2015, 2016, and then the conjunction that's coming up here now on the horizon will be the end of this cycle. And with my background and what I just introduced about high value information, I'm going to focus on essentially the problem that needs a solution, right? And that has to do a lot with this cycle. Okay, so February of 89 and November of 89, this is when the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn occurred. Again, this was when the first speech on global warming, and that back then it was called global warming, it wasn't called climate change. That was in 1989. Not coincidentally, also 1989, the UN suggested that there was a 10-year tipping point. We hear about that all the time now, right? Obviously, it didn't happen. I'm going to show you that article in a couple of slides, okay? And then just as a reminder, Margaret Thatcher made her speech, again, about this new global threat, right? And what she was doing was introducing this idea, right? This idea that, we can tax carbon, make more money. There's a global problem, and there's only way to solve that is a global solution. In other words, all countries coming together in one global order is really what the intentions of Saturn, Neptune, and Capricorn are at the heart of it, right? It's like, and we're going to prevent war, right? But like I said, both the top, both the who pretend to be the left and the right kind of work together to get all the countries on board for that intention. And that was really the intention, was to get us at this point to be in that global order. Okay. But we'll talk about how things are falling apart in that realm. Also back then, around the late 80s, early 90s, there was a widespread, talk about lingering contrails, right? Contrails coming from the airplanes. People call them chemtrails. I mean, technically they are still condensation trails. There is water vapor condensing onto particles. It's just, the question is, what are those particles? Why do those clouds linger, right? When most contrails just disappear. For the context of this, we don't care about what the chemicals are that are being condensed upon. But we're going to talk about the thermodynamic consequences of creating these like human cirrus clouds. Okay. And then maybe not coincidentally, and then we're going to hit on this too, we'll see how that works, is Pfizer actually received its patent for the mRNA technology. So I'm not picking on vaccines specifically, but I mean, I should say generally, I'm picking on the mRNA technology. The patent was received in 1990. So right around the beginning of this cycle. Sort of like the nuclear weapons, when there's a toy to play with, a lot of times there's a an impetus to find an outlet for that toy. So and we're going to see how 30 years later, when Saturn returned to Capricorn for the first time since this conjunction with Neptune, how that I think you remember what happened 30 years later. But yeah, we'll talk about that and how that fits in. So I just wanted to throw that in there too, just as an added capstone to that. And it's just interesting how carbon dioxide is being attacked here. This is just a basic diagram of photosynthesis, right? You need sunshine, you need carbon dioxide, and you need water. Those three things, and you can produce a carbon-based vegetation. That becomes our food. That becomes all the trees on the planet. That becomes everything that is life on the planet, and that makes the oxygen so that the mammals can breathe, right? So the whole cycle of life is basically dependent on having sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. So if you're gonna try to reduce any of those three things, if that's your goal, and if you think about it right now, we're going to talk about how just yesterday there was an article that I'll show you in Britain where they're going to start exploring the idea of, or they're going to actually, I think they're going to officially allow for spraying the skies to block the sun, and we obviously know there are plans in order to reduce carbon dioxide. Right. So two things that will kind of reduce life essentially is what they're trying to do. But I digress. Anyway, so the world will end in 12 years. We all heard that from Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. Okay, she said that in 2018, referring to 2030 as the year when the tipping point will happen, et cetera. Of course, there is Agenda 2030, which is the Global Economic Forum. The UN and things like that. They're very much into the idea of, again, having us in a global order by then, and had their plans worked out with who was president in the United States in 2016, we'd probably be there right now. But it's interesting, Al Gore, literally, like I said, in 1989, beginning of the Saturn-Neptune cycle in Capricorn, that was his first speech on global warming, right? That's 30, so 30. She said this in 2018, 2019, so it was like 30 years later, right? Okay, and he's right. He's been saying it for 30 years. In fact, she was born in 1989, which is at the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn. So pretty interesting. Okay. Don't pay attention to anything on the middle or the right yet. Look at only what is on the left. Okay. I said a couple slides ago that the UN in 1989 had announced that we had a 10-year tipping point coming. So this is just the first couple paragraphs of that. It says, environmental officials says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend, again, we're talking about global warming. They didn't say climate change back then. They had to change it when it wasn't warming like it was supposed to. Global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. So we all remember the disasters that happened 25 years ago in the year 2000. If you don't, I'm sure it was just too traumatic, and that's why you can't remember it. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of refugees, et cetera, et cetera. He said the governments would have a 10-year window of an opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. And things are still not beyond human control. I think, we're doing okay. And if we're going to show some high value information to show that is true. This is all low value information. Okay. This is a great example of low value information. In this middle slide here is just a bunch of examples of blaming life for causing climate change. Because now we're doing more modern articles. So we're talking about climate change instead of global warming. Moose eat so much, they may worsen climate change. What does that even mean? What do you mean worsen climate change? What climate is great? What is the ideal climate? There's no specification. The cutest climate change culprits, Arctic ground squirrels. Hungry wild pigs are worsening climate change. Beavers are accelerating climate change in Alaska. Study suggests a link between feral horses and peatland carbon emissions. I get it. You get it. The link between obesity and climate change. There was recently an article this past week about dogs and climate change, about how owning a dog is contributing to climate change. Again, because they call it climate change now, it's just very vague. And what do you mean? Because the climate always changes. Never hasn't changed. I'm going to show that too as well. Over here on the right, we have this is great because the math doesn't really work out on this, because every single one of these kind of claims the same thing. Finland is warming faster than the rest of the world. Canada warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. Australia is heating up faster than the rest of the world. South Pole warming 3 times faster than the rest of the Earth. Africa is warming more and faster than the rest of the world, right? Israel warming up as fast. New England warming up faster than the rest of the world. The idea is that wherever you live, you're going to pick up on that, and you're going to feel guilty, like, oh man, what are we doing here that we can't change? But the idea is, if for all this to be true, mathematically, there would have to be a whole bunch of places that are, warming half as much or 1/3 as much as the rest of the world, right? Because if there's an average, this doesn't add up. They can't all be above average, right? And where are these places that are, warming up less or not warming at all, right? They're not talking about that, because in reality, this is just low value information to stir an emotional reaction, and that's all it really is. Okay, but anyway, that was all started. This whole thing was started at the beginning of this cycle. When we get to the waxing square, June 98 to April 99, it's late 90s. I was in college. I was a meteorology major, and I was trying to figure out if I even wanted to do it, what kind of work I would do. And that's when this whole idea came to me. It was brand new back then, 1989 it started. It was the birth of weather derivatives. That's a market for weather risk management. It's kind of like insurance, okay? And you probably have never heard what this is. What was funny is when I did this talk at the San Diego Astrological Society, is there was actually someone in the room who knew exactly what this was. He actually works with it. He works in like finance and whatnot. So he this was not new to him. It was new to everybody else in the room. And it was new to me in 1999 when it came out, when the Chicago Mercantile Exchange introduced trading weather futures. So what it really is energy companies, or any company with a bottom line that's affected by the weather. So for example, you have a ski resort, you own a farm. If you own something that has a lot to do with the weather, then you could trade weather derivatives. So you can hedge against losses. So for unexpected weather events. So you're basically like using like climate forecasts for that specific summer or spring or whatever it is, that growing season, and you're hedging bets. So if you're at a ski resort, for example, you might hedge a bet that you're going to get a certain amount of snow, and if you don't get a certain amount, you might be able to get paid out. Okay, so it covers you if your ski resort didn't get enough snow for you to have enough activity on there to make a profit, et cetera. So that's generally how it works. Very interesting. Okay, and it seems innocent. Okay, but it comes out of this idea that, remember, the whole birth of this cycle has to do with the idea of us affecting the climate, right? And then what has to be done about that to stop it, right? Okay. And this is also energetically consistent astrologically. Saturn in Taurus, Neptune in Aquarius. It's the idea of like monetizing a structure, right? Monetizing Taurus structure for this very nebulous Neptune futures, Aquarius, right? So, like they say, you never know, you can't control Mother Nature, right? Or can you? But anyway, here, exchange traded weather futures jump in popularity. You can see, because that was in 1999, but again, here, 20 years later, it was still kind of like not that popular, but over the last several years, it's skyrocketing. So there's a lot more contracts for trading weather futures, et cetera, now. And again, that seems all innocent and everything. Here's just a brief list of some companies that do it, because people say, well, it's, who these companies and whatnot. So, I mean, it's out there. It's not something new. And the reason why I bring it up is because it creates incentive, at least, to modify the weather for profit, right? Because if there was a way to, control is a strong word, but if there was a way to, modify the weather, in other words, make it rain more, make it snow less, make it, do something where you could then profit off of it because of, your payouts. Well, that's an interesting development, right? If only we could control the weather, right? Or modify the weather. But anyway, just why would we want to modify the weather? Outside of that, I have that right there, modification for profit, weather derivatives. But I mean, we can go just to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. This is just a random workshop that I found from 2008 in Colorado. So just to show that this is not new, and this is a conference on planned and inadvertent weather modification. So it's talking about hurricane modification specifically. And this has been going on for a long time. In fact, the first successfully modified hurricane was Project Cirrus. If you look it up, it's 1947, where they worked on steering a hurricane that ended up hitting Savannah, Georgia. Okay. And there was actually like lawsuits and things when people found out like what happened there, how the government was actually, intentionally making a hurricane turn in a direction it wouldn't normally turn. So we've had the technology to do this stuff for a long time. It's only perfected now. Okay. And that makes you wonder, what could that be used for? Well, for the military intentions, for national security, could we use it to protect ourselves, for example, from a hurricane, protecting from disastrous storms? But think about it. It can also be used as a weapon, right? The Air Force published a paper called Owning the Weather by 2025. That was back in 1996. It's interesting because here we are in 2025, right? And I don't think the government or the Air Force owns the weather at this point. I think that's a little bit, outlandish, but certainly they've been experimenting with it since 1996, if that was their intention, right? Okay. And then there was a Rutgers University climatologist that claimed that his department in New Jersey was where they hired, basically the people were hired by the CIA to control other nations' climate. So that's the other side of hurricane modification or whatnot. Is what if you could steer a hurricane into a place where you want to weaken the economy or, whatever you're trying to do to overturn a government, right? That could be done if you have the technology to do it. If you're interested in more weather modification in general, I would recommend Climate Viewer. Just Google that. That is Jim Lee. He has a lot of videos he does on it too. You don't have to agree with him on everything, but as far as organized information goes, his website's amazing. It goes back 100 plus years of all the patents, all the programs, anything that has to do with weather modification, whether it's government, private, whatever. He has done a really good job at compiling it all. So if you just want to go to the high value information, he has it on his site, right? That would be my recommendation. And again, with this, like I said, this is not new. You go back to 1961, JFK even said, we shall propose further cooperative efforts between all nations in weather prediction and eventually in weather control. So when the Air Force wrote that paper in 1996, that's 35 years after Kennedy said that. So this has always been in the back pocket of the government and Department of Homeland Security, the idea that we could use weather modification as a weapon, essentially, right? So one way we can modify weather is through cloud seeding. Cloud seeding has been around for a long time. When I took an atmospheric physics course my senior year of undergrad, I remember having a test question on where we had to use calculus kind of based physics to figure out if you have a certain amount of what's called silver iodide, which is a rain enhancer, essentially, how much more rain could you expect with this volume of silver iodide, right? We had to do the math on it. So the idea is the way that rain works, rain doesn't fall out of the sky in thin air. All a cloud is condensed water vapor on a particle. There's natural air particles. If there was no particles, it would never rain. Okay. And all silver iodide does is it increases the probability that water vapor will condense onto a particle, and because it increases that probability, it increases the chance that it'll be heavy enough to actually fall to the ground. So it is used to enhance rain. It's been used for decades to enhance rain. Okay, so we learned about it in atmospheric physics class in around 2000 or so, and at that point it had already been being used for 50 years or more. So it was not new in 2000. It's not new in 2025. So that's one way we can enhance rainfall, right? But think of the implications of that, because if you enhance rainfall here, then you decrease the rainfall downstream. So you're essentially stealing the potential moisture of the area downstream, which might have got that moisture had you not taken it out of the air. So there's a lot of implications for this when it comes to regulation and whatnot, but it goes under the radar, okay, quote unquote. But there's a lot of programs in the US, outside the US, it's all over the place for that. Another thing that, so in other words, that's, this is one way we can affect the weather is through enhancing rainfall. Another way is by affecting the temperature of the atmosphere. This is a paper that was done in 2004 that went over the 3-day period in mid-September that followed 9/11, where there was aircraft grounded, right? There was no aircraft flying. So there was no jet contrail influence on the climate, right? Like I said, these are affectionately known as chemtrails because they linger unlike regular contrails, right? But they are essentially just water vapor condensed onto a particle. And what's funny is here, this is an actual meteorologist talking about it, right? And they're referring to them as homogeneous cirrus. So cirrus clouds are just high clouds. They're wispy high clouds. They're naturally present, but when we're creating them with the air, the contrails, et cetera, now we can call them man-made cirrus, right? That's homogeneous, man-made cirrus clouds. So like it says, you can't make this stuff up. This is true. It's been happening. It's been going on for a long time. And I only bring it up because, again, this study went over that 3-day period, and it compared that 3-day period to other mid-September periods in the past, so over many number of years. September is a great year to do a study like that because, generally speaking, it's really nice weather across the whole U.S. And like, if you remember 9/11, New York City, that was actually like, outside of the aircraft situation and the smoke that was coming from the buildings. I mean, there wasn't really any clouds in the sky. It was probably like 72 degrees and sunny. Just very stable weather is my point. And so that's something you could pretty much expect at that time of year, anywhere across the US. It's going to be pretty predictable as far as what it's going to be. And so what this study sought out to do was to see, by not having those contrails in the sky for those 3 days, like, how does that 3-day period compare to those that same 3-day period in other years? And what they found was that there was a stark increase in what's called diurnal temperature range. And all that's DTR for short, is if, for example, the high temperature was 80 degrees and the low temperature was 60 degrees, then the DTR is 20. It's just a difference between the high and low. That's all it really is. But all that was printed in this study in 2004 was the results of that daily temperature range. They didn't print anything about what the high temperatures were, the low temperatures were. They just printed out, and they found out that there was a significant expansion of diurnal temperature range during that 3-day period that the planes were grounded relative to that similar period in other years. And so intuitively, what that makes you think is like, wow, you take away the clouds, those man-made clouds, and the daily temperature range expanded. Oh, it must be warmer. The clouds must be cooling it. And that's the opposite of what is actually true. And that's because high clouds, these cirrus clouds, they have a net warming effect. They reflect more heat down to the earth than they prevent heat from the sun coming in. Okay. And that's well known. That's not a new thing, that low clouds have a net cooling effect. High clouds have a net warming effect. And so I was curious about this. I was like, why wouldn't they print the highs and lows? Right. So I actually emailed David Travis, and he was very easy to communicate with. And what he told me was that they did initially publish the highs and lows to make the distinction, to show that the high clouds were having the net warming effect. Right. And then I said, well, and he said they would have published it that way, but the National Science Foundation, who was funding that study, said, no, we only want that paper if it's expressed in DTR. In other words, DTR is really a useless piece of information. Okay, I think the National Science Foundation was curious to see if we were warming the planet essentially inadvertently by having the cirrus clouds as a result of aircraft. And they found out that they were right, that we are warming the planet with that. So if we take those away, it cools it, because what happened, the reason why DTR expanded during the time that the planes were landed was because the low temperatures were lower. The high temperatures were pretty much the same as they would be in any given year, but the low temperatures were lower without the presence of the clouds, because more heat could escape to space. Okay, that's what I mean. This is why cirrus clouds have a net warming effect. And so pretty much found out what you would expect to find out. And it's pretty significant as well. Okay, so if that's confusing, you can rewind and listen to it again. Also send me questions if you do have any. I will be happy to explain further. But the point is, we found out with that study that, oops, yeah, if there's any warming going on, it's probably from us. And that's especially clear to see here, because again, the maximum temperatures were not affected. Minimum temperatures were significantly affected. They were significantly cooler during the planes being grounded than they would normally be. Okay, that's what we found out. So we found out that those cirrus clouds are leading to warming in the minimum temperatures, not the maximum. And you can see here, this is measured summer maximums in the US. Okay, and so this is only the summer months, so it's probably June, July, August, and it is only maximum. It is not minimum. So it's not average temperature. It's not the average between the max and minimum. It's just max. And like you can see here, the trend from about 1895, which is like 100 and, over 125 years of data here, is downward, right? And you think, whoa, wait, I thought it was warming. I thought it was global warming, right? It's because the minimum temperatures are actually going up. So the average temperature, right? The average temperature, you can make an argument that, yeah, there has been a rise in average temperature since the mid 1800s. But that's a rise in average temperature, not in maximum temperature. Say the maximum temperatures were peaking in the 1930s. That's 1934 right there. And they've been coming down pretty steadily ever since. Okay. So it's not as hot in the summer in the US as it used to be. And this is high value information that tells us that. Okay. This is not headlines. This is not, this is the hottest summer ever, hottest summer. Not according to the data. Again, not according to high value information. It isn't. But the idea is when you tease that out, when you separate the maximums from the minimums, and you don't use average temperature, you can really see that. I mean, it's not getting hotter in the summer. And if carbon dioxide was the culprit in causing warming, you would see that here, because carbon dioxide doesn't work at night. It doesn't work in the poles when it's the winter time, because all it can do is absorb and re-radiate heat. It can't store heat. Okay, and so it's a signature you would see during the daytime during maximum temperatures. It would be if CO2 going up could cause warming, you would see it in this graph, and it would be going up with the CO2, but you don't see it. Okay. Anyway, 31 states right now are putting forth legislation to clear the skies. Now, in my opinion, so this is not high value information, but in my opinion, they're not clear on the difference between cloud seeding and homogeneous clouds, in other words, that are from aircraft. A lot of people mix them up. They see the chemtrails, what they call them, chemtrails, and the homogeneous clouds. And they say, oh, they're cloud seeding. It's like, no, that is not cloud seeding. Okay, they're two different things. Okay, so it is unclear to me whether they're clear of what they're actually legislating against. Okay, are they making a distinction? Are they legislating against both? Are they saying no to cloud seeding and no to homogeneous clouds? I don't know. Florida is actually just the last couple of weeks passed the Senate bill to do this. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes forward. So this is not like conspiracy stuff. This is reality. This is in the legislation where we're understanding like where humans actually affect the weather and affect the climate. It's not CO2. It's in the things that we actually do to our skies, and that includes intentional cloud seeding. Okay, so that takes us to the culmination phase of the Saturn-Neptune cycle that started in Capricorn. This is 2006, 2007. Okay, this is when the film Inconvenient Truth with Al Gore was released, and it was brought to this is what brought widespread awareness to climate change, the whole narrative. It was also used to indoctrinate students. So if you are probably like early to mid 30s or younger, this is probably something you saw in the classroom as part of your indoctrination / education, which is, what's the difference, right? And lots of errors in that movie. I remember seeing that. I mean, I was in my mid 20s. I had just finished a couple of years ago my second master's. I taught global climate, like I said. And so there's some things in this that I was just like, what? Because, part of me back then was kind of like confused because I knew the high value data, which didn't really suggest that anything crazy was going on, but the low value information was influencing me. And so I kind of was on board with the idea of, the global warming narrative, even though the data didn't jive. Anyway, also in that year, 2006, the UN had climate talks where they resulted in the first general consensus amongst world leaders for greenhouse gas emission reductions, which basically means carbon dioxide reductions, right? So this is the culmination. It all started in 1989, the first talk by Al Gore, Margaret Thatcher talking about the new threat to the globe, right? And this whole idea of us warming the climate, et cetera. And now it's culminating with getting into the mainstream, right? Getting actual leaders on board to do something, quote unquote, right? To solve the problem, the global problem from a global perspective, right? This is the globalist, perception. Also in 2006, in California specifically, in the state, they had an act where they were basically going to reduce overall carbon emissions in the state by 2020. I don't think they've achieved that. I mean, that was 5 years ago. I don't think that it was achieved to reduce carbon emissions, and it's not like it's made any difference. Also in 2007, This is when carbon trading was kind of birthed out of the EU. And so this is similar to weather derivatives that we talked about, right? Where you can make money, right? With carbon trading, you could trade carbon and make money. Weather derivatives, you can make money, and especially if you can modify the weather, you could, fraudulently make money by modifying the weather, which is kind of like next level, evil, Dr. Evil kind of stuff, right? Anyway, and then in November 2007, so just after this period, this is when there was some litigation that was going on, Massachusetts versus the EPA, and what it resulted in was CO2 being okay for CO2 to be regulated as a pollutant, not that it is a pollutant, because CO2 is not a pollutant. Okay, so there's a list of pollutants in the EPA that are regulated under the Clean Air Act. CO2 is not one of them because it's not a pollutant. It's part of the natural, cycle of life, essentially, right? But what that ruling said was that even though it's not a pollutant, it could be regulated the same way that those pollutants are regulated under Clean Air Act. They're not going to list it there because that would be scientifically fraudulent. But they basically said, yeah, you can regulate it the same way, even though it's essential to life. And we're going to see how it's actually more dangerous to have less CO2 than to have more. Okay, and we'll get to that. Anyway, 2008. This is, I was a Weather Channel fiend when I was a teenager, college, whatever. It was purchased in 2008, and the whole format changed. It was an NBC affiliate, bought it, and they fired a bunch of people. They created a new format, and that format was basically severe weather, fear mongering. Everything's the biggest storm of the century, right? Everything. It used to be pretty tame before 2008, where they just, reported on the weather, showed up to the weather events, and they were neutral about it. If a storm was weakening, they were talking about that. Now everything's worst case scenario, right? So thank you, NBC affiliate. So this is where the media kind of got their hands in it. And then notice the new logo for the Weather Channel has those homogeneous clouds in it, right? Those man-made cirrus clouds, as if that's normal, as if that's natural, right? So you can see how things change there during this culmination phase. And just speaking about Al Gore, Inconvenient Truth, here is a graph that he used, a version of this graph, wasn't the exact graph, but where he showed the peaks and valleys. This is the natural glaciation and retreat that happens in the climate. Notice how it happens at regular intervals, about every 100,000 years. We have a rapid warming, it lasts about 10 to 12,000 years. Then there's a gradual glaciation. The glaciers advance over the continents. And then whoop, big warming, everything melts. And then a gradual glaciation. Big warming, everything melts. Okay, our recent big warming, that started around like about 20,000 years ago. Okay, and it peaked right in this modern time. Okay, the last 10,000 years or so. So we're in what's called an interglacial. This is an interglacial here. We're in this interglacial. There's another interglacial there, and interglacial there. So we've been in an ice age technically on Earth for 2.5 million years. So this is going back, 400,000 years or so. So take that back like six times the length of this graph, and it follows the same pattern, because this is all solar cycles. Okay, this is like the Milankovitch cycles. It's like chapter 1 of climate science is the Milankovitch cycles, and this is the orbital aspects of the sun and Earth. So there's times when the Earth is in a warming phase, rapid warming, when the sun and Earth are at the right angles, and then there's times when it's cooling. That's the way it's been for 2.5 million years. Okay, and all we are in right now, and it's actually cooler than the last. Look at you, just in this phase. And if you go back, I don't have it, but if you go back, it basically every interglacial is a little cooler than the last. Okay, so we're gradually falling deeper into the ice age that we're already in. Okay, where our interglacials are brief, and then the glaciations happen. Okay, and it's hard to distinguish in this graph between what's the cause and effect, right? Temperature and CO2. And this is what Al Gore did, was he didn't say it outright because he knew it wasn't true. But what he said was every time that CO2 is up, temperature is up. And every time CO2 is down, temperature is down. He didn't say it's causing it. He just said they were happening together, which is what it looks like, because the scale isn't good enough for us to see what's really going on there. If we actually take, and then before I get to the next slide, a lot of people say, oh, look at that peak, in the CO2, that's so much higher than the peaks here. There's a great study by David Dilley if it's, I can send you to it. It's great. They found out that the way these were measured was a little wasn't the most accurate, and that they found that there actually were peaks at these, the same, not quite as high as ours today, because we do have some human influence in the CO2 level. So not quite as high, but high nonetheless, like a strong peak, especially right before the turn to the next glaciation. So we're in a big peak right now, which means that we're about to finish this interglacial. So that's another topic for another day. But anyway, if we take if we go here about 150,000 years ago, okay, to 100,000 years ago. So this section here. So we're going to just look at this section and stretch it out. Okay. Notice here, it's a lot easier to see what's causing and what's being affected. So it's very easy to see that temperature goes up first, carbon dioxide follows. Temperature goes down, carbon dioxide follows. So there's a lag time, and it's actually about 600 to 800 years of lag time where the carbon dioxide follows temperature. And the reason for that is because the Earth is 70% water. Okay. This is where the carbon dioxide is stored for the most part. And when it's colder water, more carbon dioxide can store. When the water warms, it has to release carbon dioxide. It's just the physics of it. It's kind of like when you open a can of soda. Once it starts warming, all those are carbon dioxide bubbles. That's carbonated, soda. That's releasing into the atmosphere. The same thing. And so where we're at now is similar to here, right? We're at the, right at the end of, at the end of the interglacial. This is the interglacial there, right before the glaciers started coming in again. Carbon dioxide is still going up, essentially, and then finally it starts to come down with the temperature, right? So it's temperature causing carbon dioxide, not the other way around. In fact, there's no high value data or information ever that has found a link between carbon dioxide causing temperature rise or temperature depletion. But there's a lot of sense of, it makes sense with the oceans would be, causing the other relationship where temperature is causing carbon dioxide. Okay. And then that takes us to the waning square. Okay. That was in late November of 2015 to September of 2016. And the major theme of this phase of the cycle was now that it's in the public lexicon, people know about it from that culmination phase in 2006, 2007 and beyond. Now it's all about these agreements, these global agreements. Okay. And so it's funny because during the 1 degree orbs of this waning square with Saturn and Sagittarius squaring Neptune and Pisces, the first one was a Paris Climate Conference, which resulted in a legally binding global climate deal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And there was also talk about geoengineering. So weather modification and the ways you can combat and modify climate change. So in other words, using climate change as an excuse to geoengineer the climate. Okay. In other words, cause climate change and say that you're justified in doing it because of what we're doing to the climate, right? And then there was another summit in China. And then the final square was the UN Climate Conference, which was basically ended in the Paris Climate Accord. And this is that big one that when Trump was in office, his first term, he got out of the Paris Climate Accord, and he also did it again during his second term. And everyone said, that's terrible. Why would you do that? Why would you get out of it? In the next slide, I'm going to explain why that actually makes sense on a practical level, why you would do that. And it's interesting that all these leaders, so this whole time period, they're all flying around these climate conferences, burning a whole bunch of fossil fuels, which is supposedly causing the climate change. That now they're talking about geoengineering, and it's just a real hypocritical kind of thing to do. And here's an interesting thing: there was a peer-reviewed paper that talked about how it's okay to lie about climate because information manipulation has an instrumental value. In other words, it's better to convince us of something and then just assume that it's true and then take action on it, right? And that's really a big part of this global corporatocracy that is the theme of this Saturn-Neptune cycle that we're coming to an end to now, okay? And, on the topic of this geoengineering, okay, it's interesting because just like a week before I did that talk in early April at the San Diego Astrological Society, that I did this talk essentially, this popped up on my Facebook feed. So I took a screenshot of it. I'm not following science. They must be legit, right? They call themselves science. And here it says geoengineering could be crucial in the fight against climate change. Exactly what they were talking about back during the waning square, right? Now here we are at the very end of a cycle, and they're trying to like, make a last ditch effort to make this happen, right? And so this is like 4 different ways it could be done. And the top 2 have to do with like blocking the sun, essentially, with pollutants. Lo and behold, right? How environmental is that? Let's use pollution to block the sun. Let's block an important part of photosynthesis, right? And then here we have carbon dioxide removal. So one wants to block the sun, one wants to remove carbon dioxide, both essential in photosynthesis, like we said before. So they both want to hurt life. In my opinion, again, this is my opinion. What's happening down here with the carbon removal? Carbon dioxide, like you're going to see in a few slides, it isn't as significant as we are told to believe that it is, and that's what the high value information will tell us. So to me, this doesn't really make too much of this. This is not very egregious. Just getting some carbon out of the atmosphere, like whatever. I mean, sure, hey, we are putting extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's not much, but if we can just cut our emissions out by doing something like this, I mean, I'm not 100% against it. I don't think it has to be done at all, but this is pretty benign compared to what this wants to do up here. These injections of like soot, essentially, that'll block the sun, block photosynthesis, etc., and put pollution in the air. Okay, and it's interesting enough. Just yesterday, today's April 23rd. This was published. This is a British newspaper. Okay, experiments to dim the sun will be approved within weeks. So, it's right on time. Again, it's like they know that this cycle is over, and so this push to force it in there is really on the docket right now to get things going. But this is, you can't make this up. So this was not included in the talk I gave at the San Diego Astrological Society. So you get it here on this webinar and on YouTube because it came to me literally yesterday, and I had to add it in. So just from a geopolitical perspective, like I said before, CO2 emissions, we're misinformed about it a whole lot. Okay. As far as what we emit, which again, we're going to see here, it's not much compared to what is the total in the atmosphere. But let's just look at the countries represented here. United States, we can go back to like the mid 1800s, not much. Maybe about 1900. The US is, leading the way, higher than anybody. Then around 2000, that's when China took over. And since 2000, the United States has been reducing its emissions. Okay. All these little European countries pretty much weren't emitting much at all, and they're reducing. Okay. And then you got India, which is on a rapid increase, but just not as high as China yet, but China's just going through the roof. Okay. So geopolitically, unless you can stop China and India, those would be your targets really, from emitting carbon dioxide, which the Paris Climate Accord exempts them, right? So the only countries that are included in the Paris Climate Accord are countries that are already essentially reducing CO2 emissions. So you would not be reducing CO2 emissions in the first place. Okay. So it's from a policy perspective, it's nonsense for the US to be part of that kind of a treaty. And that's not political. That's just common sense, because if our emissions are going down and we're exempting the emissions of the countries that are skyrocketing, then the math doesn't add up. You're allowing more emissions essentially. So you're just strapping your own country economically, and not actually solving the problem you're proposing exists. Okay. But it goes a step further than that. Let's just say we could theoretically put all these emissions to zero. Let's say like some technology comes out or is released that we already have, for example. And now the carbon emissions and climate change idea is a moot point, right? Because there are no carbon emissions anymore. Right? I mean, it's hypothetical. We're just speaking hypothetics. But even if we drop it to zero, what I want you to see is that it wouldn't make much of a difference at all. Okay, so don't mind these two right here for a minute. Over here, this is the composition of the atmosphere. Okay, so nitrogen makes up about 78%, that whole yellow. Oxygen, we get a lot of oxygen, about 21%. That's the blue. That's almost the whole atmosphere right there, is nitrogen and oxygen. Argon, that's not even 1%, right? Just under. Then we finally get to CO2. There's other stuff in the atmosphere too, but this is just to show, some relative comparisons. So that green square, that's CO2. It's not 4% of the atmosphere. It's not even 0.4% of the atmosphere. It is 0.04% of the atmosphere. So we're talking, and this has nothing to do with the human emissions. This has to do with natural mostly natural CO2. So the percent of that 0.04% that is from humans is minuscule. Okay, minuscule. And so that white right there is all of this. Okay, so even that huge jump from China is still almost nothing. Okay, I mean that's like this is high value information. Okay, and that could be like a slap in the face to the idea, because I saw a couple of videos where they were interviewing like politicians, representatives, people that have been elected to the House and the Senate and whatnot, and asking them just candidly, like, what percentage of the atmosphere do you think is CO2? And their answers range from like 5%, which is like, that's going to be more than 100 times what it actually is, right? And then people are saying like 30% and things like that, right? And it's literally one. If you divided the atmosphere into 2,500 parts, one of those parts is carbon dioxide, and more than 90% of that is natural. That's what this high value information tells us. Okay. Another thing with so again, even if we regulate carbon, it doesn't affect the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, because that carbon again is naturally skyrocketing. Like I said, I could show you that study David Dilley did, right at the end of each interglacial. That's just what happens. Okay, so we are not responsible for that spike. We're responsible for a part of it. This is not zero, right? This is here, but it's so minuscule compared to what's there. So even if we could control every amount of carbon dioxide emissions from humans, it would make zero difference. And if it would make zero difference, then even if CO2 had the heating effect we're told that it does, then it would be out of our control. You see, it would be nature doing it. But the good news is that the heating effect of CO2 is limited. It's kind of like it's what you call saturated, right? So if you paint a wall, that first stroke of paint, that first coat of paint makes a big difference. So like that first 20 parts per million of carbon dioxide makes a huge difference. It does have a warming effect. But then the next 20, the next 20% or 20 parts per million, sorry, that is a significantly less warming effect. And then significantly less from there. Pretty much you get around like 150 parts per million, and that's when it's pretty much maxed out. Like you're barely getting any warming effect, anything along those lines. And 150 parts per million, like this says here, that's when plant growth shuts down. So if you don't have at least that much, every bit of life on Earth dies. There's no life on Earth anymore. Okay, and we were dangerously close to that during the last glaciation, which again at around 20,000 years ago is when we had our rapid warming that has led us to where we are now in the interglacial, which was natural. That we were at about 180 parts. We were only 30 parts per million above the crisis zone. So, but fortunately, carbon dioxide naturally rose, right? And so we were able to have life. And then this is pre-industrial levels here. That was level in 2010. This is old, but where we're at now is about 420, a little over 420. But you can see, there hasn't been an effect in the whole industrial time. There hasn't been a warming effect. There hasn't been an ability to warm, because again, painting a wall, each coat of paint has less and less of an effect, right? That first coat makes a big difference. The second coat makes some difference, but not as much. And by the time you get the third and fourth coat, it doesn't matter how many coats you put on, you're not making a difference, okay? And so even if we double pre-industrial levels, we're up here in this level, which is, what they talk about wanting, that's going to be devastating and everything. It's not, because this is just the physics of it. Again, just high value information, just like this is, just debunks the whole idea of carbon dioxide being, having the ability to warm, and more importantly, the human contributions to it, even making a difference to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, never mind are, adding to warming, right? And actually, this is a great study done by Boston University. It studied 1982 to 2015. So that over that period, if you look at the graph, anything green and toward the dark green is going to be a net positive as far as leaf area, and anything like yellow to like orange or whatnot is going to be a net negative. Okay, so you can see there are some patches of like the oranges and yellows and whatnot, but for the most part, this whole Earth looks pretty green. Okay, and what that study concluded was that the only logical conclusion they can come from is that it's this, this increase in carbon dioxide that we've had over that period. And again, most of that is natural. We can't pat ourselves in the back and say, hey, because we've been burning fossil fuels, we're greening the planet. It's not true. Because our amount is so insignificant relative to the natural amount. But being at the end of an interglacial, or again, we're about to enter the next glaciation, it'll take a while. I wouldn't worry about it. It's going to take thousands of years for the glaciers to form and then spread down into the continents. But that spike in CO2 is really helping plant growth throughout the world. And before we take a little break here, just to show you another thing when it comes to the idea of warming being dangerous, okay, or that we're in some kind of extraordinarily warm period, for example. The 1990 IPCC report, which is basically the UN, this is their intergovernmental panel on climate change. And so it's UN, so it's globalist special interest. The very first report, they do reports every several years. The very first one included these two graphs. These graphs are literally from that report. So they're literally just cut out. That's exactly what they had in those reports, was these two graphs. Okay, the first one goes back about 10,000 years. So this is our interglacial. Remember, if we go back here, we're in this interglacial right here. So this is just stretching or concentrating this area. So this coming out of that 20,000 years ago, whoop, we warmed up, and then this is where we are now. Okay, this is the interglacial. Okay, and so the peak of this interglacial, the maximum warm period, was about 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. You see that in that range? That's a lot warmer than we are now. Okay, and during that time, it's interesting to note, like if we see the Sahara Desert today, Northern Africa, just all sand. It's just the desert all through and through. And then, but if we look at it 6,000 years ago, this is what it looked like. So when we were in, when it was warmer, we had a lot more life going on there. There was lakes, there was rivers, there was, lots of wildlife. There were humans here. 6,000 years ago is not that long ago from a human perspective. Like Homo sapiens were around then. Okay, so very different landscape. So the climate changed dramatically from this to that as it cooled. Okay, so cooling had a negative effect on the environment. That's natural cooling having a negative effect. And that's true across the board, because now if we take this 1,000-year period, so starting about here, now we're going to stretch this out, and that's what this graph is. Okay, so it's just going back about 1,000 years. So that little hump right there is this medieval warm period. That dip, that was heading into the Little Ice Age, and then now we're into the modern period. The modern period, not as warm as the medieval warm period. So that period from like 1,000 AD to 1,200, 1,300 or so AD, very warm. Okay, just to take England as an example, England was growing grapes, creating wine during that period. Okay, during the Little Ice Age, the Thames River in London would regularly freeze every winter to the point where they had festivals on the ice. They could plan them. Okay, it was going to freeze over every single year. Okay, back in the medieval warm period, when they were making grapes and growing wine, growing grapes and making wine, the Thames River did not freeze. And in the modern era, the Thames River does not freeze, but they can't make wine in England. Okay, so that just shows it. And that's just like your biological proof of where we're at relative in terms of relative temperature to different periods of time. And what's also interesting is that when this drastic cooling was happening, okay, just like this cooling here, which is even more drastic, caused this climate change. Well, this cooling, caused mountain glaciers to come into towns and whatnot and crush homes and buildings and things like that in like Switzerland and places like that. But also this is when a lot of females were getting burned at the stake, being accused of being witches, okay, because they were accused of using witchcraft to change the climate, to hurt the crops, essentially, because crops like warm, crops don't like cold. You want longer growing seasons, you don't want shorter growing seasons, okay? And the shorter growing seasons were blamed on witchcraft. And then just to reiterate that, the idea that cold-related deaths or heat-related deaths, what's more common, so these are in percent of, out of 100,000 people, but we're like right around 9 to 10, 8 to 10% is typical for cold weather deaths per 100,000 people, but only around 1% per 100,000 people for heat-related issues. So humans are adapted to the heat. We have sweat glands. It's easier to cool off when it's hot than it is to warm up when it's cold. If you don't have fire, if you don't have shelter, the cold is not gonna be good for us. So just the whole philosophy of heat being bad and having to prevent it, like, so if climate change was about CO2 causing warming, that it's like, well, what's wrong with that, right? But I think the good news is, based on high value information, we know that number one, warming is actually good. It has always been good throughout history, and we don't have enough. CO2 doesn't have enough effect. Doesn't have enough warming effect, like we said here. Once you get saturated, and the amount that we're responsible for doesn't make a difference anyway. Okay, so this would be a good time for a break, and we'll be back in just a minute. All right, so welcome back. So yeah, a lot of information there, I understand, and thank you for sitting through that and for sharing if you're finding it very interesting. And I just want to talk about now what we're here for, really, because I've kind of set up this whole the whole way that the Saturn-Neptune cycle works. Okay, how it's worked in the last two cycles, how we're coming out of the final this recent cycle, and how we're seeing the breakdown. Essentially, we're going to see more of that breakdown of the narratives and the themes from that. Anyway, so Saturn-Neptune, there's 0 degrees Aries. It's not happening in isolation. Okay, like I mentioned, it being the rise of the individual before, but it's especially true because it's going to happen in the vicinity of a sextile to Pluto and Aquarius, which we all know is very powerful for societal transformation, and in the vicinity of a sextile to Uranus and Gemini, and those two planets will be in a trine to each other. So it's all three outer planets, the evolutionary planets, with Saturn anchoring them in at the center, at the 0 degrees Aries point. So, I mean, you can't reiterate enough how significant that is in terms of anchoring in a new societal evolution. Okay, it's like, in my opinion, we're done with being ruled, by overlords, essentially, right? The top-down rule, the manipulation of information, etc. And we're at a time where, like, we're coming into freedom. And are we going to see technologies that result in medical and other technological advances that essentially free us? It could be literally have technologies that eliminate the need to use carbon-based forms for energy, which basically makes the Berlin Wall fall, essentially, right? I'm calling the climate change the Berlin Wall of this cycle, where it just becomes a moot point, and all this effort to regulate carbon emissions and get the policies together become a moot point, because we have the technology to not have it make a difference anyway, even though the math didn't add up in the first place, like we saw with the high value information that we showed before. But it would just make the story a complete moot point. But yeah, Pluto would be in Aquarius through 2044, Neptune and Aries through 2039, and then Uranus and Gemini through 2033. So at least into the early 30s, this is all kind of in effect. And so we're going to see, in my opinion, a very, very rapid change. And it's going to be so different from anything that we've been around. I think, a lot of us are here on a soul level for this transition. Okay. But anyway, some astrological context to where we're at at the very tail end of the Saturn-Neptune in Capricorn cycle. Okay, one bigger so we're going to follow Neptune and Saturn in Pisces, because I think that's important, since Pisces is the final sign of the zodiac, and then those two planets are what we're talking about. They're meeting up in Aries, right? So we have to talk about what we're getting rid of before we talk about what we're going to build, right? So Neptune in Pisces since 2011. It was in Pisces for about 4 months in 2011, then officially in February 2012 it entered, and it was in Pisces all the way up until March 30th, and now it's in Aries for a little while until October, before it goes back into Pisces and then back into Aries, where it'll be for good. And so this whole time period, Neptune being the ruler of Pisces, the modern ruler of Pisces, has one of the negative sides of it is deception, right, and confusion, right? It's very spiritual, and so I think this has been a very spiritually awakening time, but maybe spiritually awakening because of the deceit. People are waking up to deceit, and that is the awakening, right? Waking up to the deception. And I think Neptune going through Pisces has just kind of been this karmic time of those in power, kind of like the man behind the curtain kind of situation, right? Deceiving us, and then it becoming obvious, and then therefore the end of that deception, that period of deception has to happen. And in the new birth, which is, Neptune and Aries, when we can fully actualize ourselves essentially in this body, if you think of Neptune and Aries in that way. And so this has been the era of fact checkers, which is really narrative reinforcement. So you can also think of Neptune and Pisces as the narrative, right? That's the title is this talk, Narrative to Discernment. So it's all about painting the picture, painting the narrative. And so it's very similar to Thought Police, with Orwellian kind of concepts, for example. This has also been the era of tech censorship, right? Blanket censorship. When we get into like the 2020 era, it got really ramped up, right? But also victim consciousness, right? Definitely a time of, a lot like trying to win the oppression Olympics, essentially, right? That's been, one of the more negative sides of Neptune and Pisces. But again, all this negative stuff has been to drive the positive, which is that spiritual awakening, that final awakening into the reality. And so what goes along with that, and if you look at the percentage of Americans who have confidence in newspapers and television news, that has dropped since the mid 90s, right? And the big reason for that is like that final chapter with Neptune and Pisces is the deceptions that are becoming more obvious, right? Same thing here with average total viewers. You got the big networks really dropping off like a rock, right? And that goes from 24. So this is the Neptune and Pisces era right here, right? A couple of years after Neptune's and Pisces, drops off like a rock, okay? It's getting harder and harder for the deception to happen. So like here's a nice little meme. And I think another great thing that came from Neptune and Pisces is the meme, right? If a picture's worth 1,000 words, then a picture with a few words on it is worth even more, right? So now it's time to go over the carefully selected stories that have been chosen to manipulate your emotions and your thinking. Very Neptune and Pisces, okay? Here's just a quick little rundown of, different policies and things or in organizations that were involved in the timeline of manipulating media, for example. So it goes all the way back to like the Council on Foreign Relations, 1921. This is when it was getting well known that people were too informed, essentially. So magazines like Time Magazine, et cetera, were purchased and owned by like the wealthiest people, the Rockefellers and the JP Morgan and things like that. The Council on Foreign Relations was created to create the global narratives about what's going on in the world. United Nations, that was formed after World War II. That kind of morphed into like the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, World Economic Forum, the UN's IPCC, like we talked about before, for climate change. In the 1950s, there was the CIA involvement in the media, which was Operation Mockingbird, if you're not familiar with that. Very interesting. It's not a theory. There's some 1970s Senate hearings where there are senators that are actually grilling CIA agents and asking them about their involvement in the media, because this is just a way to try to manipulate public opinion. In the 1980s, when at the beginning of the 80s, there was a lot of different media companies. By the end of the 80s, there was only like 6. Okay, so a big media consolidation that upped the ante as far as controlling the message in the masses. The Telecommunications Act, we don't really have to talk about too much, has a lot to do with the rise of the internet and the idea of platforms. Section 230 was protecting platforms. So like, for example, Facebook can't get sued because someone said something on Facebook, right? It's like they're not liable for what someone said. That it was just protecting them because it's not a publisher, it's a platform. Okay. Anyway, a couple of astrological things that happened that are very significant that we're going to talk about here briefly is the Venus occultation cycle in Gemini, which the most recent one happened in 2004, 2012. And then the fixed star Regulus entered Virgo in 2011. And those both happened, the end of that Venus occultation and that fixed star entering Virgo happened right around the time of the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, which happened right after Neptune entered Pisces for good, for good meaning for the next 13, 14 years. And that was an act that it was a modernization of an act that came out in 1948. Okay. And then this other bill we won't really talk about too much, but this is significant. The Smith-Mundt Act, I should say, in 1948. What that was, this post World War II, and so what that was was basically a law that was set in place in the US that basically said, yeah, we're allowed to use propaganda to influence, voting in other countries to go our way, et cetera. We can, influence public officials. We can do all these kind of things. We can, use funds to like fund certain, politicians and whatnot, but we can't turn that on American citizens. That's what the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948 said. What the Smith-Mundt Act, that when it was modernized in 2012, which was again right after Neptune entered Pisces when things got foggy, was that, oh, by the way, yeah, we can use that on Americans now. Okay, and this is when the media got really divisive, because before that, there was a sense of like seeing both sides, having different opinions, right? But at the start, when that started, that's when narrative development really exploded. This is basically Neptune and Pisces going nuts, right? So they really created two different sides, totally different narratives, right? And it created a split in the populace. Okay, but it happened at a very awakening time with that Venus occultation in Gemini, fixed star Regulus. So we're going to talk about how that comes together. Okay, just an example of the mainstream media, and now that we're in this post Smith-Mundt modernization time, so now we can be propagandized. Now it's legal to propagandize Americans and to also fund politicians and judges and things like that on the inside here. We're not just doing other countries, doing it to ourselves. So an example, so on the left-hand side is pre-Ukraine Russia crisis. The Guardian, they're actually criticizing the Ukraine here. Welcome to the Ukraine, the most corrupt nation in Europe. Ukraine's neo-Nazi problem, right? You can't say that now. A Ukrainian comedian turned president is embroiled in Trump's impeachment mess. Ukrainian president's rule becomes increasingly corrupt, authoritarian. So actually referring to Zelensky as authoritarian, like you'd never hear that in our media now, right? Because now post-Ukraine crisis, the fight for Ukraine is a fight for liberal ideals. For foreign fighters, Ukraine offers purpose, camaraderie, and a cause. Ukrainians are giving two lessons in democracy that Americans have forgotten. And then now, instead of criticizing Zelensky as an authoritarian, we have Zelensky, the TV president turned war hero. So you can see how it's just a matter of phrasing and creating that narrative. So this is Neptune and Pisces just in action, right? With, again, on a policy level, that's that Smith-Mundt Modernization Act that happened right at the time that Neptune entered Pisces. Okay, so I mentioned the Venus occultation, very important shift we went through that finished in 2012. These happen once every 21 years. They always happen in Gemini. And so an occultation is basically an eclipse. It's when Venus crosses the sun. Okay, it's small, it's too far away, so it doesn't block the sun. It's not something you see. You're not going to notice any darkness when Venus crosses the sun, but it's significant. And it has to do, because it's in Gemini, it has to do with connection consciousness. Every time it goes through a round, it happens in a pair. Every 8, it's 8 years apart. So the last one was 1874, 1882. And then we just had our most recent one in 2004 and then 2012. Okay, so at the end of that one was right around when that Smith-Mundt Modernization Act happened, right around when Neptune entered Pisces, etc. So each round represents kind of like a ratchet up in human consciousness, if you want to think of it like that. And in this case, specifically connectivity consciousness, right? Connection consciousness. And a great way to look at it is like, prior to 1874, the only way you could communicate at a long distance was with letters, which could take weeks to months to get to someone. By the time we got to the end of that window, now we had electricity, we had phones. Okay, so theoretically, you could communicate with anyone anywhere in the world in an instant, no matter where you are. I mean, it wasn't technologically feasible as far as like logistics go, because it wasn't, they didn't exist everywhere. But theoretically, anyway, you had the technology existed if the infrastructure was present to do that. So a very different paradigm of communication happened there. In the most recent one that started in 2004, ended in 2012, this one is, I think, a little more obvious. I mean, 2004, for example, is when Facebook started. Okay, so this is basically the rise of social media. Prior to 2004, we had the internet, we had cell phones, but we didn't have the internet. The social media web that we have today, where information can spread like wildfire, right? Where people can be connected, where you could connect with multiple people, over space and time. Okay, by the time we got out of that window, now it was theoretically possible, even though maybe not technologically feasible, but theoretically possible with the rise of YouTube, with other social media platforms, things like that, where it was possible that anyone, you don't have to be um, you know a, a famous person or a politician or something. Any individual theoretically could reach every individual at one time. Again, bandwidth aside, it's theoretically possible. Like if I make this video, it's theoretically possible that every single person on the planet could see it, right? As long as they have internet access, right? Because it's on YouTube. So it's possible that everyone could see it. It's probably not going to happen, but I'm just saying that it's possible, right? And that paradigm didn't exist prior to June 2004, right? Only the privileged could really put information out there. Now anyone could put information out there. Okay, so we're in a very different space than we were in other recent times. So it's just interesting that like the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act happened almost like as a desperate act to start propagandizing and manipulating our opinions and our perceptions of reality, right at a time when we're awakening to the ability to not have that happen anymore. Okay, so well timed. The other thing I mentioned was Regulus moving from Leo into Virgo. So it's a very slow moving. We're talking like 150 BC till right up until 2011. Okay, that's when it entered Virgo, and like it says here, it's a 2100 year cycle. I mean, it's going to be in Virgo for a while, but it was in Leo for a while, and pretty much anyone watching this right now, unless you're about 90 or older, or if you're 13 or younger, has actually unless you're 13 or under, you have Regulus in Leo. But anyone who's younger than 90 or so has Regulus at the 29th degree of Leo, which is the critical degree, which we're going to talk about in a second. So as one of the four royal stars, this portends great change for humanity as it transitions from a kingly or aristocratic age to one of service and humility, right? Leo to Virgo. So the power will shift from the rich and noble class to the common working people, who will no longer be looked upon as ignorant slaves, but who will be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. So this goes back to the Venus occultation. Like I said, though, anyone can reach everyone, right? You don't have to be a somebody. And that's the concept. So right around the same time that happened, we have this happening, right? Where everybody matters. The working class, you don't have to be a noble class, for example. And that's just that transition there. And so the next slide, we're going to talk about, talking about timing. Remember before I said that, the global, there was no more left and right. There was just the globalist left and globalist right, starting with Bush Sr. and, everyone that came before them. And then in 2016, it was supposed to be another globalist, globalist leftist. Hillary Clinton was supposed to be president. And then that would have taken us to where we are now. But it got, it got disrupted. And we're going to talk about that on the next slide. But just a quick overview of Regulus in Leo versus Regulus in Virgo. Again, 29 degrees Leo, anyone born in the late 30s to about 2011. So that's pretty much everyone, except for those people that are about 13 and younger and about 90 and older, have Leo at 29 degrees. Have Regulus at 29 degrees of Leo. And this transition really has a lot to do with transition from separation consciousness, codependence, and connection consciousness, which leads to sovereignty. So if you believe you're connected, then you can live sovereignly. If you believe you're separated, then that's when codependence is created. But anyway, Regulus in Leo is imbalance, masculine and feminine. There's this hierarchy of authority. There's collectivism, which is like we always hear fascism and communism, etc. It comes from this hierarchy of authority. Centralization of power, which includes also electric power, right? So centralization of electric grids and whatnot. Also allopathic medicine, so thinking of the body as like mechanical parts. A big thing that happened, especially with Regulus at 29 degrees Leo, was the rise of sports and entertainment and politicians as like gods, right? So since the late 1930s, like starting with like Kennedy on TV with Nixon, that was the first time people actually saw presidents debating on TV. And it showed how charisma can make a difference, right? And in sports, we saw the rise, especially once we got into like the late part of the 1900s, where the salaries of sporting, of people that play sports, professional sports, just ridiculously skyrocketed, right? So that goes with the Regulus in Leo, that imbalance, right, of power. Also entertainment. We started worshiping celebrities. worshiping politicians, worshiping athletes. Okay, that came with, again, Regulus at 29 degrees Leo. And then also part of that is, Earth as a resource extraction source, and then our value as far as how useful we are to the state. Okay, that's what matters. With Regulus and Virgo, now we get a more masculine feminine balance, decentralization of authority. So Virgo has to do with the pieces, right? The individual pieces and the details. So decentralization of authority. Okay, microgrids as far as energy sources is concerned. Comprehensive medicine, holistic, individualized, right? We're not just machines, like one medicine works for you, another one works for another person. So individualized plan approach to medicine. Sovereign empowerment. So instead of worshiping people outside of us, we are, we're staying, holding closer to our principles, etc. And you can see how, there have been attempts, recently to almost enforce this old Regulus and Leo habit, with this idea. Like, the idea is, like, you used to be able to throw, celebrities with a certain politician, and that would give them more clout, for example. And that didn't really work in the most recent presidential election, right? Who was getting all the celebrity endorsements, right? And that person didn't win, right? Because people don't care about celebrity opinions anymore, right? And so that's just a good example. Also, like this whole flight, this Blue Origin that went up here recently. It's just like famous people, and it didn't go over well. Okay, like it was a very Regulus and Leo move. The idea to kind of mesmerize the public with like this stunt, and it didn't have the effect that they wanted. And the reason for that is, that's why I have the cell phone picture here, is that all of us being born with Regulus and Leo, especially those from the late 30s to 2011, because you have 29 degrees Leo, we're still charged essentially with that Regulus and Leo energy because we were born with it, right? Now there's no place to recharge. So as time goes on, we're only 13 years into Regulus and Virgo, that charge is going to wear out. And the only place to recharge is from the Regulus and Virgo. And that's why, like, over time, all attempts at Regulus in Leo methods of, like, hierarchy of authority, of celebrity worship, etc., that's all kind of falling away. Okay. And so the person that actually really is, well timed when he arrived on the scene in a significant way is someone that not only has Regulus at 29 degrees Leo, but that has Regulus at 29 degrees Leo rising. Like, literally 29th degree of Leo is Donald Trump's rising degree. Okay, so I see him as the Regulus president who came in right after Regulus entered Virgo, and he represents that Regulus in Leo in a lot of ways, right? I mean, he comes in as a celebrity, like literally a celebrity. Like, he's the first president to not have a political history or a military history. So he literally had a celebrity history, right? And so that's kind of what brought him in. But I see him as the disruptor. So I'm looking at him objectively. I'm not like for or against, just that objectively speaking, with Uranus on the North Node and the Sun, very much here to disrupt. He also has Mars on the ascendant, right on that Regulus. Okay, so his spiritual role was to disrupt something. What did he disrupt? Like I said before, 2016, that was, from the globalist perspective, they were supposed to have Hillary Clinton there. And this anti-globalist, this pro-right sovereign state, America First person comes in and ruins that globalist dream. And what was happening was interesting. The summer of 2016. So not only was he the Regulus president with 29 degrees Leo rising, but what happened was his progressed sun in the summer of 2016. So progressed sun moves about 1 degree a year. So he was born with the sun in Gemini, late Gemini here, and it moved 1 degree a year. And literally the summer of 2016, it not only crossed his ascendant, but across from Leo into Virgo. So literally symbolically went with the same movement of Regulus from Leo into Virgo. His progressed sun did the same thing while crossing that ascendant. So it's like the timing of him relative to the energy makes a whole lot of sense. It's astrologically appropriate that this energy would come in at that time, and it had a very successful effect at disrupting the globalist order and the whole what is anchored in essentially in the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn. Okay, and so the next slide here is just I understand it's a male and a male and a female. But think about it. Doesn't matter what this is. The idea is being critical thinking is going to be very important for Saturn, Neptune, and Aries. Because we are entering this more sovereign discernment time period. So letting our emotions in our minds go in either extreme direction is very, important to not do. And this is the result essentially of that Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012 that allowed for propaganda on the American public, right? It allowed for emotional manipulation. It allowed for, funding and things of that nature. So whether you're deranged by the idea of the regulus president and the disruptor that he is, like in my opinion, he came in at the right time. He's the right energy for the right time. It had to be disrupted because heading where we're headed now. It's not that he's the leader. We're going to create it. It's Saturn, Neptune, and Aries. So we are coming up with it as individuals. We're creating society from here on out. We're not being top down led. Okay, but someone had to get in the way of that, right? But so that's why you don't want to worship it either, right? Because worship, like seeing him as the hero that it's the new direction we're heading, that's also false. Seeing him as like the evilest thing because you've been convinced by the globalists that you want the globalists, for like that their intentions are your best intentions, which aren't. Either side is wrong, is what I'm saying. The way I see him, again, this is not high value information. This is my opinion. This is Sloth. If you've seen the movie The Goonies, this is the scene where he's holding up the rock because this is, they found the pirate ship. The Fratellis are coming. The cave is collapsing, and so he holds up that rock to let the kids slide under his legs and go to safety. I kind of see, Trump as like using the sloth analogy, right? He's serving a purpose. He's one of the Fratellis, right? He's one of them, right? Again, he was a celebrity. He came in like with wealth and everything else. So he's kind of one of them. Like you see him with all the celebrities and whatnot, right? He's one of them. But in this instance, he's serving a purpose. He's holding up that rock, and it's the way for us to get out. But we're on our own. That's the idea. This is the necessary timing of where we're at now. Instead of being under total control for Agenda 2030, now we're going to enter a whole new world where we can figure it out ourselves. Okay, and that's so like he says a lot of things. Some things I agree with, and some things I don't, because everyone's, in my opinion, you can have a nuanced opinion about everybody. But the most poignant thing he ever said, I feel like reflects his soul mission, which is reflected in his chart and the timing of when he came in and everything, is he said, "They're not after me, they're after you, and I just happen to be standing in their way." To me, that's like his spiritual mission, is literally doing the sloth analogy. He's in the way of what they intended for us. And now the globalist regime is falling apart because now we're coming to the end of the Saturn, Neptune, and Capricorn cycle. Okay. And, this is also showing, it's reminding that they all loved him at one time until 2015 when he announced he was going to run for president, right? It's all public perception. He was a celebrity. He was a special guest on Oprah, The View. They loved him. Everybody loved him, right? He was even like probably the biggest financial and moral supporter of the 1988 Jesse Jackson campaign. Most people don't remember that, and that had more to do with Jesse Jackson being a New Yorker, right? It was more like New Yorker camaraderie than anything to do with politics. Okay, and that also speaks against the whole racist idea. He's portrayed as a racist, but why would you support African American candidate if that was true? Anyway. A great quote from Malcolm X, the media is the most powerful entity on earth. And again, especially with the post, Smith-Mundt Modernization Act in 2012, upping the ante on dividing us. Okay. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. They control the minds of the masses. And this is not to say, again, this is not to like, because obviously they try to make Trump out to be like the worst person in the world, mostly because he's anti-globalist. He's against their agenda. Okay. That doesn't make him the hero of the world either. Okay, it just makes what, if you're falling for either of that, then you're going to too much extremes and not having enough discernment. And what's interesting now lately, it's again well timed that we would see the disruptor be involved in auditing the government, something that a lot of people have mentioned they were going to do before, like Obama, like Clinton mentioned, eliminating government waste and things like that. They never did it. They talked about it, they didn't do it. But it's always been something that's been popular. generally speaking. And what we found out now is that the mainstream media is well funded by what's called USAID. It's the Agency for International Development. It's a kind of a manipulative acronym because it sounds like it's aid, and there is some aid involved in it, but the vast majority of this is not going to aid. Okay, it is going to things like funding journalists, like funding politicians in other countries and things like that that we want, that we favor and whatnot. But that's something that we found out. Okay, so that takes us now. Remember, I mentioned that the mRNA vaccine was, I don't even think it's really a vaccine. It's more of a therapy, in my opinion, because a vaccine would definitely prevent the spread and infection of a disease. And this obviously has not, even though we were lied to about it. Again, Neptune is in Pisces strong in 2020, 2021, around this time. But what also happened was we had doubling down of the Capricorn energy. So, Saturn and Neptune conjunct 1989 set the stage. But Saturn returned to Capricorn for the first time since 89. And then it joined Pluto in Capricorn at that time. Okay, so this is a really strong double whammy. I remember in 2019 looking at that conjunction coming up in 2020 and saying, oh boy, what are they going to do? Because it just felt like it was going to be a lot like a contraction energy. Okay. And I didn't know what was going to happen. I had no idea a virus was going to come and that they were to lock us all down. But, it turned out we had a virus, which was the catalyst to lock us down. Again, it was a doubling down on that Capricorn energy, that control energy. Okay. So you can almost think of it as just a means to an end, really. They were kind of testing, how far they could push us. So this takes that whole Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn and again, doubles it down. Okay. I mean, and then you add Neptune in Pisces. So there's a lot of foggy information happening. If you said anything about the virus coming from a lab in 2020 or 2021, you could lose your YouTube channel, for example. Now it's considered the likely source of the virus, right? That's just the way it is. The government overreach was insane, right? It was basically climate change policy on steroids. It's like, don't move, don't do anything, don't breathe, don't, and then it gave this excuse for experimental therapy known as mRNA, which again started with the beginning of the Saturn-Neptune cycle in Capricorn. Just after that, in 1990, that's when the patent was received by Pfizer. Now there was a reason to play with it. Just like, again, there was a reason to play with the nuclear weapons when those were invented. Now there's a reason to play with the mRNA technology now that it exists. It's the same thing with the atom bomb. And a lot of scholars say that, Japan was about ready to surrender to Russia at the, in the mid 1940s to end World War II. And then the US went ahead and dropped bombs on them before that could happen. And I mean, honestly, it was, we have a toy. We've never seen how, we tested it over empty land. We've never seen how it actually affected a population. And that would be a great little experiment. And unfortunately, that's what happens is when there's a toy, they will be played with. And the mRNA, I'm sure they wanted to play with. They wanted an excuse to create something. And they told us, when that, so number one with the virus, it was like, first it was the masks, right? Don't wear a mask, save those for nurses and whatnot. And then 2 weeks later, wear a mask. And then 2 months later, wear 2 masks, right? And so there was just no consensus there. And now we come to find out, studies show that the masks did nothing to prevent you from getting sick. Yeah, they had some value in preventing yourself from spreading sickness if you're sick, which is why nurses and doctors wear them in surgery so they don't infect the patient. But the holes are too small to prevent yourself from basically receiving the virus. Okay, so there was no effect scientifically using high value information for the masks. We were told all kinds of weird stuff with the virus, right? That you could be asymptomatic and spread it, that you could have no symptoms and it's just nonsense. The whole 6 feet apart was nonsense. That's what we're finding out now. And then when it comes to when in 2021, when the experimental injections came out, you were assured that if you take it, you can't get the virus. You can't spread the virus, right? And then if you don't take it, that you're at risk for death, like sure death, right? And none of that was really true. And what's interesting is that in the summer of 2020, as if they weren't already working on the book, the Great Reset came out. That was part of the World Economic Forum. That's Klaus Schwab. if you're not familiar, he actually he was ahead of the World Economic Forum for like 50 plus years, going back to the 70s. And he just resigned because they found out he's basically fraudulently using funds, getting high cost hotels and basically like using money in ways he's not supposed to with the World Economic Forum. So he's just stepping down now, which is very energetically, appropriate. Again, because Neptune has just exited Pisces. It's in Aries now. Again, we're coming to this close of the Saturn Neptune cycle in Capricorn. And so these big entities that are also funded a lot by those U.S. Agency for International Development funds are now suddenly going to get defunded. Okay. So we're witnessing literally the collapse of everything that was intended by the global corporatocracy, this globalist system that started with Saturn, Neptune, and Capricorn in 1989. Okay. And another interesting thing, going back to the whole CO2 thing. Okay. So this is Mauna Leo, the measurements. You can see that. Yeah. CO2 rise is been on the rise. This is the parts per million. Okay. So just from like 1960, it was under 300. Now we're like a little over 420, right? It's been rising, but again, most of that is natural. We have a very small effect of that. And what proves that really is 2020, because with the lockdowns, it was pretty much worldwide lockdowns, right? There was a whole lot less CO2 emissions from humans, a whole lot less. But that just shows you how insignificant they are, because there's no dip here. There is a natural dip and rise every single, like seasonally speaking, and that is because in the northern hemisphere kind of runs the show, because it's most of the land mass is in the northern hemisphere. So when it's the springtime in the northern hemisphere and the plants come out, they suck up a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere, so CO2 drops. When it's the fall and they drop their leaves, that's when CO2 will rise in the atmosphere. Okay, so CO2 rises in the atmosphere heading into winter in the northern hemisphere, and it falls heading into summer in the northern hemisphere. And so what we would expect to see if we had a significant amount, this is measuring the total atmospheric concentration of CO2. There's nothing to do with human emissions. This is just how it's rising. Again, due to the fact that we're toward the end of an interglacial, it always spikes at the end of an interglacial, and it just shows that we're at the very end and we're about to glaciate again. But in 2020, there should have been a dip here, and then it should have continued to do its normal thing of going up, right? But there should have been a dip if we had a significant effect on this, but we don't. And we kind of showed that with the high value information, with a few graphs back there. But this reiterates that, because where's the signature of the massive reduction in human emissions? In fact, this shows how ridiculous any global policy would be to reduce CO2 emissions. So a Paris Climate Accord, for example, this shows how it would do nothing. Even if we had China and India not exempt, we would do nothing, because in that case, we wouldn't be able to reduce CO2 like we did during the lockdowns. Okay. So just again, reiterates that point using, again, high value information. You got it right there in your face. So we went over a little bit of Saturn, Neptune in Pisces. Now we're going to talk about Saturn in Pisces, since again, that is, part of the pairing that we're talking about, this transition from Pisces into Aries. And Saturn entered Pisces a couple of years ago in the spring of 2023. And it is, it's going to enter Aries here in May. Then it's going to come back in the fall to Pisces, and then it'll join Neptune again in February of 2026, like we said. And Saturn has a way of kind of correcting the delusions and illusions of Neptune. So this here, we got, the pin poking the balloon. So think of Neptune as the balloon of illusion, and all the stuff that happened during COVID, and all the stuff that were, the way the media has manipulated us ever since the Smith Modernization Act of 2012. And the Saturn is coming in 2023 and popping that bubble. Okay. And it's a couple of nice quotes here. The Mark Twain quote has been modernized. It used to read, "It's easier to fool a man than to convince a man that he's been fooled." Now we just modernized that to be gender neutral. Either way, it says the same thing. Okay. But the idea is, it is easier to Neptune in Pisces someone than it is to Saturn in Pisces someone. Okay. There's no polite way to tell people they've dedicated their lives to an illusion. Okay. And so just to going back to, I'm going to look at both things, both the idea of CO2 induced warming and climate change, and then also things having to do with the mRNA vaccine, because again, both of these things initiated in 1989 with the start of the cycle. And so all three of these papers came out very recently. So this one's 2025, 2024, 2024. Okay. So there's so many that you can find. I just do a few on here just to show. Like this one here, the analysis rejects the theory of human caused atmospheric carbon dioxide increase. So what this is saying, what this study found, if you dig into it, I didn't want to put everything in here, but you can look at this yourself. All the details are here. Is that we're not contributing enough carbon dioxide to the atmosphere to make a difference, is what this basically concludes. And that sea surface temperature and the cycles of the sea surface temperatures, that really rules when it comes to what we observe as far as warming and cooling cycles. Okay, and then this right down here, this one was great. They did an infrared flux data study, and what it showed was the opposite of what you'd expect. So it says, in other words, increasing CO2 delivered a net cooling effect, the opposite of what should happen. Okay, and so that's based on measuring the top of the atmosphere and the infrared flux and whatnot. So there was a 60-year study. So it basically proved the opposite. So if anything, a rise in CO2 would cause cooling, is what they concluded. And then here, this is a really interesting one. A couple of these authors, I met him before, David Legates. I've met Willie Soon. Really, this guy's hilarious, like one of the funniest guys. When he gives a talk, he's just hilarious. Anyway, but they did a critical reassessment of the human-induced, that's anthropogenic, CO2 global warming hypothesis. It says empirical evidence contradicts the IPCC models and the solar forcing assumptions. And what this also included was some AI. Some in the Grok 3 beta is actually one of they've tested different AIs, and that one comes out on top as far as being the most accurate. Now, all AI has its shortcomings, absolutely. But what this did was they did some more human aspect to this study, but they also used the AI to dive into studies in general, and they did something that humans can't do as fast, and it just the media only shows certain low value information, right, to the public, but there's a lot of high value information in these studies that never gets shown by the media for a reason, because it would contradict the narrative, and they don't want that. And so what the AI did was it dove into like all the actual studies, the high value data, the high value information, and it came up with the conclusion that solar forcing is wrong in those models. It's again sea surface temperature ruling, not CO2. It basically like showed that everything about the narrative is wrong. So again, this is happening while Saturn is in Pisces. It's basically popping that bubble that has been with us for a long time. It's been building, and it's astrologically time for perhaps that Berlin Wall to fall, right? Because we're at the end of the cycle. So everything that has to do with the globalism and the global problems that require global solutions falling away. Okay. Other things that we've heard, right? Low value information. Like how many times have you heard that like hurricanes are increasing, major hurricanes are increasing, that tornadoes are increasing, etc. If you look at the data, when it comes to U.S. landfalling hurricane frequency, it's actually going down slightly, okay, over time. And then that goes back to 1850. So it goes back quite a while. And then when it comes to major hurricanes, so category 3 or higher, that's pretty flat line. And notice there's a gap there between 2006, 2015. There was no major landfalling hurricanes in the U.S., okay? And, what would cause that gap? Well, nothing, really, variability. That's about it. Nothing. There's nothing that we're doing that is making any difference. Tornadoes, it goes back to about 1950. You can see the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was a lot more strong tornadoes, EF3, 4, and 5. That's the strongest categories. And since then, they've gone down pretty much. There's one little year here around like 2011. It looks like, natural variability. But in general, a lot less tornadoes now. A lot less violent tornadoes now. And that doesn't mean anything. It actually does. It actually coincides with the circulation, ocean circulations, the AMO, it's Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. That's what it's called. And during the cooling phases, tornadoes go up. During the warming phases, which we've been in since about 1980, they go down. Okay. And we're about to head up again. So tornadoes should increase over the next, say, 10, 20 years. That'll be because of the cooling of the North Atlantic, not because of any warming. It's the opposite of what you think. That's because tornadoes, in order to have violent tornadoes, you need really strong pushes of cold air, into places where the warm air already exists. So in other words, the warm air is already going to exist in the south. But if the cold air doesn't come down hard enough or fast enough, you're not going to get as much severe weather. But when it does, like during the cooling phases of that ocean circulation, you get more violent tornadoes. So it is actually following the natural pattern, but it's the opposite of what we've been told. Every time there's tornadoes, like I saw, there was a Netflix special that just came out about, I think it was about Joplin, Missouri, that happened in 2011. Okay. In fact, right during that spike year, right? And then at the end of that Netflix special, it has that like almost mandatory thing to say is like, violent tornadoes are increasing due to climate change. It said it right there. And so that's just, again, it's a narrative, but that's proven wrong by high value information. This is high value information. We can see that violent tornadoes are decreasing over time. Now they could increase over time in the future, like I said, but that would be for a different reason than it's not due to climate change. In fact, it's due to natural climate fluctuations. So other things that you hear, right? So again, this goes back to 2009, John Kerry said scientists project that the Arctic will be ice-free in the summer of 2013. And then just this past December, same kind of article, again, low value information, all low value information. Nearly all Arctic sea ice could melt by the summer of 2027. So there's the same prediction about summer sea ice that now we're supposed to forget that it was made, several times before. Okay, this is the actual high value data of summer sea ice going back to 2006. Okay, it has a natural fluctuation, seasonal. The ice freezes when the sun disappears for 2 months, and then when the sun comes back and it's out for 2 months straight, it melts. Then it freezes, and then it melts. Okay, there is some variability, like up, down, going up, down, up, down, up. But when you look, the red line basically averages out, and there's no trend. Pretty much flat. It just kind of goes up and down, up and down. It just ebbs and flows with natural cycles. That's all it really does. And so just to understand, the Arctic is just all water. There's no land in the Arctic. There's no, the North Pole is water, but it's typically ice. It's ice all year long. The North Pole doesn't, the exact point of the North Pole doesn't really melt. The overall sea ice in the Arctic does, though. Like I said, that every single summer you get a dip. Okay, for it to get to zero on this graph, that would be down here, right? That would be ice-free. That's what it's saying. Sea ice could melt by nearly all Arctic sea ice could melt. Here it says ice-free, which basically means 0 point. And there's no indication that that is heading towards zero. Okay, so that was made in 2009. So that's right here. So they projected that it would be, by 2013, it would be gone. Okay, it was not gone. Okay, and now we got a prediction here. And the same thing, it's not going to happen. This is very much driven by the sun. The sun's presence melts, the sun's absence freezes. That's simple. There's not much that's going to affect that. Okay. And here's another interesting one. And this is lesser value information. This is great value information. This is lesser because it's only 1 year. This is just looking at this year. Total snow mass in the Northern Hemisphere. This statement was made in 2000. Children just aren't going to know what snow is. 2000. 25 years later, it's a quarter of a century. It's a long time. And here we are with snow, especially in March and April, pretty much off the charts from where it would normally be, falling somewhere in that range. Okay. Pretty much off the charts. So why is it still snowing in the Northern Hemisphere? Okay. Again, lesser value information because it's 1 year. We're not looking at trends or anything. But 25 years after that statement is made, how can that even happen? Right. And then we come to this, which is a look at what could affect sea level, right? Because sea ice can't affect sea level. Even if the sea ice went to zero, doesn't really make that much of a difference. In fact, when I showed you the warmest part of our interglacial, back when Africa was lush, there's about a 1300-year period, where the ice was going to zero in the summer, and it didn't make that much of a difference. Polar bears didn't die. In other words, polar bears existed more than 8,000 years ago, and they survived that. But that would be the only thing would be like, that polar bear argument, right? But that kind of loses its weight when you look at the reality. We're looking at actual ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica, so in the northern and southern hemisphere. And what we're told is they're melting, and that's leading to sea level rise. And that would be true if there's net melting of the continental glaciers. Yeah, there's sea level rise because that water is going to be in the ocean and not on land, right? But just to take a look, I took this snapshot again, this is all publicly available data. April 9th, just a couple weeks ago. And here is a look, here, this is your average seasonal balance of the Greenland ice sheet. So there is a melt season every year, June, July, and then in late July into August, it starts to freeze. You start to build more again, I should say. That's the average. But this year is in blue, and you can see like well above average here, about average for most of this period. And then since January or so, I mean, a lot more above average than anything below. So the mass gain, the gain of snow and ice on Greenland is pretty significant this year. Now, we don't have the whole year with us yet, but 7 of the last 8 years have had net gains on Greenland, not net losses. And this year is setting up to be the 8th out of the last 9th net gain. Okay, so that is so far from what we're told narrative-wise, right? We're told that the glaciers are melting, right? The ice is melting. The sea level is going to rise. If it rises this much, New York's underwater, et cetera, right? But the reality is it's following the natural cycle. Since about 2015, 16 or so, that, like I said, going back about 8 or 9 years, it's been net gains in pretty consistently year to year. And that's going to probably continue for about 20 years until the ocean circulation switches patterns and it goes back to the warming. We were in a warming phase, 1980 to about 2015, and yeah, there was net losses on Greenland. There was, but there was net gains before that. They don't talk about, right? They were taking advantage of the fact that we were in a warmer phase of the ocean circulation and that the ice was melting, but it no longer is. But so that ends that high value information can end that narrative pretty quickly. And then in Antarctica, same thing. This is a study that goes back like 85 years. Okay, and in the eastern Antarctica, there are, no matter how you look at it, the trend is up. So there's, again, ice gains in general for the last 85 years in eastern Antarctica. Okay, so that also is not melting, which means, if anything, sea level could be going down. It would be, it changes so minusculely, like, we're talking millimeters, that it's not going to be noticeable with these natural cycles. The major sea level rise happened between 20,000 and about 10,000 years ago, when we shot up into our current interglacial period. It went up about 400 feet, in fact. But that was because those glaciers on North America and on Europe, they were melting, and there was, that had a lot of coverage. I mean, if you look at Cape Cod, Long Island, those are basically the dirt piles from the extent of the last ice sheet. Okay, so like New York was under, a good mile of ice or whatever at the peak of that ice age. That was 20,000 years ago. It wasn't that long ago, and then it melted very quickly. Okay. But anyway, it's not, natural cycles are driving it. Another common one, just this will be the last one on the whole climate thing, is you always hear about burn acreage, right? In the US. If you go back to about 1920s to now, this is what the graph looks like. It went down significantly, and then it's pretty much flatlined. It's risen gradually since about 1980, right? But all you ever see in the media is going to be starting around 1980, going to about, so that 40 years. Yeah, there is a trend upward in burn acreage in that period, but it's taken out of context with the actual, what is actually going on, in other words. Okay. And they do that obviously to manipulate public opinion. And they don't tell you that this has to do with land management decisions. Okay. So around 1980, for environmental reasons, ironically enough, they stopped burning the underbrush. They stopped prescribed burns, in other words, because those are done to prevent large forest fires. And when they stopped doing that, lo and behold, large forest fires started happening. So, and this is a practice that Aborigines did in Australia. This is a practice that Native Americans did in America long before European settlers. The knowledge that if you can prevent large fires by starting small fires and controlling them. But by stopping doing that, and that was done for environmental reasons, they've caused an environmental problem. Okay. And this is something that Trump received all kinds of ridicule for, because he's not, all that eloquent when he speaks, but his science advisors obviously told him about this. And the way he described it, I think was during the California wildfires was that we've got to clean up the forests and that'll stop the large fires. And he was right. What he meant was prescribed burns. He didn't say that to clean up the forest. And of course, the media had a heyday, made fun of him, talking about like, cleaning, sending cleaning crews in the forest, and that's going to stop forest fires and whatnot. But again, that was true information. Now we move over to like the mRNA, and I don't want to frighten you if you took it, if you participated in the experiment. So just take this with a grain of salt, but it is high value information. These are studies. Like this study just came out last week, and this is specifically on pancreatic cancer. And basically, it came out with the conclusion that like if you got the mRNA, especially if you got a booster, that the prognosis for pancreatic cancer is very negative. In other words, like people that didn't take it have a much higher chance of survival. Okay, so there's a correlation there, a strong one. When it comes to miscarriages, stillbirths, you can see this huge spike that happened in 2021, a little bit less in 2022. So you can see like, this is when people were lining up to, drive through experimental injections and whatnot. I personally opted out myself. Like I said, I don't want to scare you if you opted in, but these are just high value information related to it. There's a couple of studies that came out. This one is from like early 2024. This one's from early 2025, the Yale study. But this one here, the Hill, just it was 99,000, or not, sorry, 99 million people that participated in the experiment. And this is a list form of what is here. So that's the same thing. But you can see how much specific manufacturers of the experiment and how many times it increased your risk of certain conditions like blood clots, myocarditis, pericarditis. I mean, that's 6 to 7 times with Moderna, AstraZeneca. That's pretty significant. The fact that they're finding that, I mean, again, this is high value information. It's a full study. I think the AstraZeneca injection was actually taken off the market. Considering that you could lose your job if you didn't take it in some cases, is just pretty messed up. This goes back to Neptune and Pisces, and then the whole double down of Capricorn energy when Saturn entered, Saturn conjuncted Pluto, and it re-amplified the whole globalist push of the Saturn-Neptune cycle in Capricorn. And then the Yale study came out, and it talks about long COVID, which is what they're calling in that study. So this is just, commentary on this study. So this is lesser value information, but it's just the way it's being. She's just interpreting this information essentially, but they call it post-vaccination syndrome, and it's similar to like in AIDS, like she's saying. I mean, it's in the fact that like your immune system is deficient, okay, and so it causes things like fatigue, brain fog, insomnia, dizziness, and this stuff developed shortly after vaccination, and it's lasting a long time. In fact, this is low value information. What I'm going to say right here is my opinion. But I don't know of anyone who didn't participate in the experiment that interprets any kind of condition where they have long COVID, for example. Anyone that claims to have long COVID is someone who participated in the experiment. So in other words, it's not from the COVID, it's from the experiment. That's what this study is kind of saying here. Okay. And then going back to the idea of the U.S. Agency for International Development Funds, we're finding out that the media itself has been heavily funded by that. Okay. And finding out where this money is going is a high priority for the majority of people that were polled here. And again, polls are not super high value information, but they give us an idea of popular opinion. And so as far as popular opinion goes, most people want waste, fraud, and inefficiency reduced, regardless of their political affiliation. So what's happening with DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, the majority of people are for it in some form. There's no such thing as a perfect way to do it. No such thing as a perfect person to have in charge of it. But the idea that it's happening is, in most people's opinion, a good thing. Okay. So this just kind of reiterates that, you have Clinton, Obama, and Trump basically saying the same thing, but these are globalists, right? And they're supposed to say things like this, cutting wasteful spending, but they're not allowed to do it. Okay, that's against the globalist code, right? Because there's a lot of fraud that does go on in there, and a lot of things that need to be hidden. And then you actually do something about cutting wasteful spending, and now you're the big enemy, because now you're the one that is ruining the global order, which is what what his job is. Like we said, that's his spiritual mission, is to disrupt those plans. But now we'll conclude, move to the conclusion with what are the possibilities now that we've been through all this, and we understand how the cycles work. And now we can just look at this potential for what this is going to be, right? Again, the sky is the limit. Your guess is as good as mine or anybody else's, because it's 0 degrees Aries. Where do we take it from here? The power is coming back to the people, Pluto and Aquarius, with Uranus and Gemini. If the last time Uranus was in Gemini was in the 1940s. This was a rapid advancement in technology happened at that time. Just to go back to the atom bomb, I mean, it went from like concept to production to implementation in a matter of a few years during Uranus and Gemini back then. And so hopefully that can be used more positively this time around. But the idea being is that like we're really in a position where, new inventions, new medical breakthroughs, again, new energy breakthroughs could really lead to a position where with the way our connectivity consciousness is now, again, we're post Venus occultation of 2012, and with Regulus now in Virgo, and the power coming back to the people, we could be entering an age or a time when these political structures that have divided us and that we're now finding are, completely corrupt, which we already knew anyway, but we're kind of proving it. We're getting high value information about that. And, we're seeing kind of Trump serve as the sloth analogy. Again, like I said before, he's just standing in the way, and we're the ones that have to crawl through the legs and then figure it out on the other side, right? Because it's our world coming in the future. It's not him. But he could have served a spiritual role that, again, blocked the intentions that were against us, right? But anyway, this is where we're at the next 10 months. Okay, what can happen? Does the government own the weather now in 2025? It doesn't. And should we allow them to further experiments to fight global warming, for example? Are we going to see the breakdown of the global warming narrative and the focus on carbon emissions? I think so. And I think I presented a lot of information for why that's associated with the Saturn-Neptune cycle in Capricorn and why it's time for it to come down. This pulse of individuality, defining our own truth as sovereign individuals, is that how does that going to look in this new era? We're going to see, I think, the rise of independent media. We already have. I mean, if you just look at the ratings, I mean, most independent media folks that have a lot of followers on YouTube and whatnot have a lot more views of their videos than like a CNN video on, or even CNN ratings, for example. So mainstream media is falling, and no one trusts it anymore, and independent media is rising. But it's at a good time because, again, Saturn and Neptune, this means self-responsibility for what we believe, self-responsibility for, what we're feeling and thinking about things. So it's a lot of discernment. We're responsible for that discernment. So we're ready, I think, in this era to digest media in an independent form where we can discern for ourselves. And with the internet and whatnot, everyone has access to all the information. So they get a nice diversity of opinion, inform their own opinion. And that's really what we should be doing. Maybe we have free energy breakthroughs. Okay. Free energy, there's just some examples of some, organizations and companies that are developing certain free energy generation, which also can have healing associated. So scalar technologies in general can both produce, theoretically produce energy infinitely and also promote healing. Okay. So maybe we have those breakthroughs, and that's kind of what brings in this era of freedom. Okay. And these are just some examples of those free energy technologies and whatnot. And, it's what's called over unity energy, which means you're producing more than it takes to run. Okay. It's interesting because just last week, April 14th, take this with a grain of salt. Again, it's low value information, but what the director of the White House Office of Science, Technology and Policy said last week, he said, our technologies permit us to manipulate time and space. They leave distance annihilated, cause things to grow, and improve productivity. This, to me, at the most, this is just like a foreshadowing, predictive programming at the most. I don't think this is some admission of anything. I just think this is a foreshadowing of collective consciousness of where we're headed and what we're about to break through. And then coming off of where we've been, when you realize that the two most profitable businesses are war and illness, it's easy to understand what's going on. Again, the power of a meme, the very positive thing that came out of Neptune and Pisces, right? It's very true, right? War and illness, war and illness. What if we stop war and illness? Where would we be? This is just, reiterating the idea again, the power of a meme. It only has 2 words on it, and it totally says everything that it means. And this is a great little quote. 99% of us, probably more than that, are good-hearted people who respect others and want peace. The other 1% rule the world, tell us we're at war. And this, I think, is my most important slide on this, because this, again, reiterates our self-responsibility with Saturn, Neptune in Aries, okay? When we take control and responsibility for the war within us, think of that. Control and responsibility, it's Saturn and Aries. Because there's a lot of disagreement within each of us, right? This is where astrology comes in. You look at your chart, you see like where your conflicts are, and those are the things you're likely to project if you don't want to own all of it. But when we do take responsibility for the war within us, we can dissolve the wars around us, okay? That's Neptune and Aries, dissolving the wars around us. Because this Neptune and Saturn and Aries together, that could be used for perpetual war, for meaningless, right? Nebulous, perpetual war. We don't want that to happen. So it's our responsibility. And that's where this picture comes, this meme comes in. It's another great meme, right? We let that person in power, that Capricornian energy, take control until we say, wait, Saturn and Neptune are now in Aries. And then everyone says, oh yeah, and Pluto's in Aquarius, and Uranus is in Gemini. We're your boss now, essentially. And this is up to us, because we can't let ourselves be divided anymore. We can't be divided with how the media works. We got to remember that like we have more in common with each other than we do with the leaders that we think are on our side, right? Okay, and that goes back to the whole idea of like the extremes of Trump derangement versus Trump worship syndrome, right? And the same systems we see crumbling in society are being called to crumble in each of us individually. So this is where that really comes into play with Saturn Neptune, because in Aries, because that has to do with individuality. We really got to take responsibility for ourselves. The outside world will not change until we change ourselves, right? And so our ability to cooperate with others and to bring peace into situations starts with being accountable for our own mental and emotional well-being. We've all heard the phrases, my body, my choice. Well, with Saturn, Neptune, and Aries, what about my emotional body, my choice? My mental body, my choice, right? Because this is what the media controls, our emotional and mental bodies. If we let them, if we let narratives control us, if we let low value information control us, that's what we're left with, is that being under control. But if we only accept high value information and we keep our emotions and our mental bodies in check and take responsibility for what we feel and what we think, that's empowering. And that's also infectious, right? And when we know and accept our internal disagreement, like I said, this is our looking at our own chart, looking at our own energy. Like, where is our internal disagreements? Because that's what leads to projection. That's what leads to, dissent, et cetera, et cetera. We can experience the healing that arises out of allowing the freedom of disagreement. Disagreement is okay. Disagreement within us and without us is okay. We don't have to compromise peace. I always say, to be free, we must disagree. If you need to agree to feel okay, to feel safe, to feel loved, to feel accepted, you'll never know freedom. Okay? Agreement is for safety purposes. It's not for freedom purposes. If we want to be free, we have to allow disagreement. Okay? That's disagreement within and disagreement with others. And so we really need to come to the table, take accountability for that. And that's really what I'm trying to work with a little bit more, is what I call creating compatibility. It's this system where I work with the planets, as well as some techniques from HeartMath, which coincide with those planets for some strange reason. I found it really interesting. I mean, I have very brief information here. You can dive into my playlist on my YouTube channel. It's called Creating Compatibility. I go very deep into this. So if that's something that interests you, you can look into that. But it's basically looking at these five um, unconscious characters in us: the moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, and Mars, and then how they operate in the unconscious modes: the earth, the water, the fire, and the air, right? And it's just very interesting. You can use this for like small groups. You can use it for large groups. You can use it for, you know, small companies, etc., families, one-on-one relationships. You can go even deeper on those. But the idea is understanding our differences. Okay, that's really what this comes down to. Understanding our own unique setup, our own sovereign existence, and how we differ from others, and how we can create compatibility based on those differences. And that's where these techniques from heart math come in, because they're literal, breathing techniques and emotional regulation techniques that come in with this mental awareness. So it's bringing in the mental awareness of our differences with some emotional techniques where we can balance our differences. And that's really the core of what this does. Because a lot of people come to me and say, "Hey, are we compatible?" And there's no answer to that question, because there's no such thing as being compatible. There's having a willingness to create compatibility. That's all that can exist. If you have two individuals that have a willingness to create compatibility, so they want to dive in to, on a mental level, what their differences are, and then on an emotional level, how to balance that, then they can create compatibility. It doesn't matter if your Mars is squaring someone else's Mars, because there's value there. There's information there. And there's a way to make that work. And it needs to be a willingness to make it work, and then it can work. Okay, so that's what creating compatibility is about. It's for this new era. It's for this, this Saturn, Neptune in Aries, with the sextiles to Uranus and Gemini and Pluto in Aquarius. It's for that energy specifically. And it came to me early because I have Mercury in Aries, so I get this information. So the whole term sovereign harmony makes more sense in this era. Creating compatibility makes sense in this era. That's the curse of Mercury in Aries, is I get information too early. Okay, just an interesting thing here on that concept of differences and respecting differences, etc. In good fences making good neighbors. This is in Minnesota. They tracked some wolf packs, and very interesting. They found how respectful the wolves are to their boundaries. Right. This is sovereign harmony right here in action. Okay, they're establishing their boundaries and they're respecting their boundaries. Okay, they're realizing they are sovereign packs. Okay, and this is just the way it looks in nature. So nature agrees in a lot of ways. So just as a final note, when all of the lights are shining the brightest, the shadows disappear. Okay, so if we think of ourselves as individual lights, as long as we're shining completely, we're honoring ourselves. That's when the shadows go away. That's when the projection goes away. Okay, respect our differences inside, then we can expect the differences outside of us. Okay, things are not getting worse, they're just getting uncovered. Okay, we must hold each other tight and continue to pull back the veil. So if you made it this far, congratulations. Very happy that you stayed with me. And like I said, if you watched it on YouTube, you probably had to break it up into a few pieces, because I think this went about 2.5 hours. So a little longer than I wanted, but there's a lot of valuable information here. I think I'm going to probably split this up and put it in pieces so it's more digestible. Okay. But the whole version will be available as well. So again, if you feel like you learned a lot here and it was a valuable use of your time, if you wanted to donate, please feel free to do so. Don't have to, no obligation. Also, if you're interested in more videos and this is the first one you've come across, please do subscribe, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. And share it with anyone that you think might find this useful. And go to my website anytime, sovereignharmony.com. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram. You can find me on Telegram. I'm on TikTok. Embarrassed about that one. But and where else am I? Yeah, obviously here on YouTube. So, find me at all the different socials. If you want to get more regular updates on astrology and things of that nature. And thanks a lot for joining. And let me know if you have any comments. Happy to answer questions. Happy to dive deeper into some of the more technical stuff that I went over. And I hope you learned something. Okay. So anyway, thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you again later.